Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. The Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. Long live the King. You may be seated. Thank you.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning, all.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor Booth.
Good morning, Mr. Schachter.
A little bit of housekeeping to do. When Professor Kersner was on the stand, we presented to him excerpts of Exhibit 2105. And the court had asked, could we please get it in a single format or in a readable format as though it were in a compendium. And we have done that now. And so we've shared this information with these documents with my friend. They're excerpts of Exhibit 1-2105. And what I would like to do with my friend's consent is to mark them as exhibits. Perhaps we could start with the larger of the two. The larger of the two is an excerpt of the source data for 1936 from Exhibit 1-205. And with consent, I would ask that to be marked as Exhibit 1-2105.1.
Are you content? Okay, thank you.
And the second document that I handed up as an excerpt of Trial Exhibit 1-2105, Spreadsheet 1, dealing with a number of entries in 1936 and 1956, and columns A, B, C, D, E, F, H, I, J. And with consent again, I would ask that to be marked as Exhibit 1-2105.2. And I see my friends nodding, they're consenting.
And do you intend to show them to this witness, or can I note that they were presented to Professor Kersner?
You can note that they were presented. Professor Kersner is not part of my questioning of Professor Booth.
Thank you. I very much appreciate this. Thank you.
Yes. When the court is ready, I'll continue.
Okay. Very good, thanks.
Now, Professor Booth, I want to ask a question about what I thought I can't recall whether it was you or Professor Kersner who indicated that in preparing the model that you put forward for the court in this case, you adjusted or took into account the criticisms of judges and tribunal members from previous cases. Is that correct?
Well, specifically the Southwind case, counsel directed us to the Southwind case,
Yes.
as well as Justice Lasker's case.
So you didn't take any into consideration in preparing your report, the criticisms of tribunal member Whalen in the Hawaiian case, 2016 SCTC 14?
I was very much aware of what he did. His criticism was very similar to the criticism in Southwind, which is the treatment of consumption.
Yes. And how did you take that into account?
In those cases, we applied a more technical economic approach. The consumption by definition is consumed and cannot give rise to a rate of return. And in this case, we've applied the rate of return of the consumer price index to consumption.
And so you say that's a differentiation from what happened in the Hawaiian case.
Substantially different, yes, because compounding at the rate of inflation, as we indicated yesterday, $1 in 70, I think it was, compounds to $34. Whereas in the Hawaii case, $1 compounds to 0 because consumption is gone. And consumption by definition can't compound.
Could
That
we,
is-
excuse me, can we get the spelling for Hawaii?
Yes, the spelling for Hawaii is HUU hyphen capital AY hyphen capital AHT.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can go to the compendium tab 1, which is an excerpt of the Hawaii case. And if you look over at page 321 of the decision, perhaps this is what you were referring to. At paragraph 321, in your model in the Hawaii case, sorry, it's not in reference to paragraph 321, but in your model in the Hawaii case, you had 2 theories on consumption. The first one you presented was that consumption should bear 0% return. Is that right?
That's correct.
But then, and I'm reading from tribunal member Whelan's reasons. He says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down on paragraph 321, the respondent's second proposal, and that the respondent was Canada, yes,
That's correct.
was to award some part of the foregoing revenues attributable to consumption plus simple interest at rates drawn from the consumer price index. And then it says in brackets, the claimant asserted that without compounding, comma, this was not in fact an inflationary adjustment. He continues, this approach would not fairly reflect the value of the claimant's lost opportunity to consume. Foregone consumption should be assessed by the same equitable principles as foregone investing and savings. And do you say you took that into account in your model for this case?
Yes, we applied the CPI and we didn't apply simple interest. We applied compound interest.
But you didn't apply the same rate as investing, though.
That's correct, because you cannot invest. You
Okay.
cannot invest. Once you have a meal or you spend anything on consumption, it is gone. It cannot possibly generate a rate of return.
All right.
Can you tell me where you just read from?
Yes, I was reading from compendium tab 1,
Thank you.
paragraph 321
Got it.
of tribunal member Whelan's decision in the Hawaii case,
Got it.
2016 SCTC 14. Now, you also mentioned moments ago that you also took into account what you said was the comparable criticisms by Justice Zinn in the Southwind case. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's also where the question of consumption comes up. And now some of the comments that Justice Zinn makes are incorrect, but they're relatively minor. When he refers on paragraph 489, the Booth-Kersner report notes the consumption spending includes spending on food relief, medical care, and education. That's not correct. Medical care and education are included as social spending, earning a rate of return. But that's a minor criticism. I think the major criticism is the criticism in paragraph 487, where we correctly stated that consumption of 100, at the point it's made, there may be a trade-off between consumption and spending, but after the consumption decision is made, that consumption is gone, and it cannot possibly generate a rate of return compounded in the future.
I
Not in
wonder,
economic terms.
all right.
If you just slow it down as you finish your sentences, thank you.
I wonder, sir, if you could turn to tab 2 of the compendium. And at page 8 of the compendium, you'll see paragraph 466 of Justice Zinn's decision. And he says, I am also of the view that there has been a fundamental misunderstanding in whitefish of Justice Collier's reference to realistic contingency in Guerin FC, period. The contingencies that Justice Collier describes and discusses in his reasons relate to the band's land, comma, its development, comma, or its lease options, comma, and the other contingencies he's consider relates to the investment return on the monies that the band would have received from the use to which the land was put. None of the contingencies he considers relate in any way to how the band might have spent the money had it received it in the first place, period. With great respect to Justice Laskin, that is not a contingency, in my view, that requires consideration at law. Professor Lazar testified that such a consideration, in his opinion, is not a realistic contingency from an economic viewpoint either. See that?
I do.
He ended up accepting Professor Lazar's opinion on that issue. Would you agree?
I think so, yes.
So that's a pretty hefty criticism of your approach of taking into account spending patterns and saving patterns. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree that it's a pretty hefty criticism of Justice Laskin's decision in the Court of Appeals, yes.
Well, put it this way. Do you agree that with Professor Lazar's view adopted by Justice Zinn, that the consideration of spending patterns is not a realistic contingency from an economic viewpoint?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. But I would remind you that our original instructions was to provide an economic interpretation of the specific wording in Justice Laskin's decision in Whitefish, which is what we've done. Justices apparently have some disagreement in terms of what equitable compensation is and whether Justice Laskin's decision was correct. And I'm in no position to judge who is right, Justice Zinn or Justice Laskin. We were asked to do an economic interpretation of Justice Laskin's decision, which is what we did. And we were asked to take into account further decisions, which we did in terms of the Southwind decision, in terms of giving a rate of return to consumption.
All right, sir, I had asked you if you agreed with an economic principle. I'm not sure.
The answer is no.
Thank you. All right. Now, when Professor Kersner was on the witness stand, did you watch him testify?
No, I was driving up in my car, unfortunately.
Okay. He had testified that the two of you did not look at the capital accounts at all. Is that correct?
I certainly didn't. That was the mandate of Professor Kersner, and we hired Ernst & Young to go through all of the accounts. They're an accounting firm and they're familiar with dealing with the accounts.
So
Just as in previous cases, we'd use Joan Holmes and Associates.
did you at all look at oh, sorry, let me rephrase it this way. You only looked at spending and savings patterns in the revenue account, not the capital account. Do you agree with that?
That's correct.
Now, did you have the capital account data?
I can't swear whether we did or we didn't. We were looking at the spending patterns, and the revenue account is where the bulk, excuse me, of the spending occurs.
How do you know if you don't remember looking at the capital account?
Because the capital account requires special approval to spend money out of the capital account. The spending account, on the other hand, is exactly what it's supposed to be, spending, which is where the bulk of the spending occurs. The way in which the capital and the revenue account works is the capital account is meant to preserve the capital of the band for future generations. So it's only under special permission can a band spend money out of the capital account.
Would you agree with me, sir, that in order to properly assess your model, It's not just spending, but it's spending and savings.
That's correct.
So you need to know what is saved and what is spent.
That is correct.
And wouldn't you need to know what is saved in the capital account like you did in Hawaiian or in Southwind?
Nothing is saved in the capital account in the sense that if you have $100 in the capital account, the band trust account rate is say 10%. And out of that $100, $10 is automatically transferred to the revenue account to spend.
Right, but
Capital account earns a rate of interest, but that is allocated to the spending account to spend.
there can be spending directly from the capital account.
The amount in the capital account that can be spent is supposed to be on capital items. So for example, you can get approval to spend money out of the capital account to transfer what is essentially a bond for earning interest into another physical asset, another capital item. It's not spending in terms of the amount that's spent by the bands on different things. It's a capital account spending.
So you wouldn't find consumption in the capital account?
Well, it depends how you look at some of the spending. I think there were some items that were charged to the capital account, such as the administration of the funds, that could be classified as consumption.
So why wouldn't you look at the capital accounts?
I think partly it was a data problem in looking at the underlying data. Because we had to look at different accounts from the bands, and as I said, this was Professor Kersner's responsibility, and this question really should have been directed towards him. But Ernst & Young were directed to look, as far as I remember, at the annual reports of the different bands, and we sampled them in order to look at them.
I'm going to give you, sir, a copy of Trial Exhibit 2105, but this time it's tab X2B. When X2B is entitled is both capital and revenue accounts. And we're going to wait till you get the document because I don't want to be unfair and ask you questions without you having your own document in front of you. Now I'll provide an explanation of this document. After Professor Kersner testified, the court had indicated that the court would prefer if we were able to produce part of the spreadsheet in what would be a compendium format. And the portion of Trial Exhibit 1-2105 at tab 2B that I want to direct the witness's attention to are the capital and revenue spending for just 2 years, 1954 and 1956, just to make a point. And it is an excerpt of 2105. So unless there's any objections, as an officer of the court, I can say that what we've done is we've just excerpted out
Certain columns
that are already in the spreadsheet. We have that spreadsheet one. We have not altered it in any way. And with that assurance to my friends, I don't see any reason why we can't mark that as 2105.3.
1-2105.
Yes, 1-2105.3.
Any problem with that?
Sure.
I don't, in principle, have an objection, but I've got this ready. Yes, I see it here. That's an absolute. Yeah, I see where it comes from. I have no objection to it.
Thank you, counsel.
All right. So exhibit 1-2103.3.
2105.3.
Oops, 2105.3.
Now, the reason why I've pulled this off of your data set is because it shows, number one, that you did have the data from the capital account. Do you agree that you had the data from the capital account now?
Yes, as I said, I wasn't responsible for this, so I can't really answer that question. But if the data was there in the capital account, I don't know why Mr. Kersner didn't include it.
Yeah, nor do I.
Well, that is a question he should have asked Mr. Kersner.
Let's take a look, though, at 1954 and 1956. And as we know, there is no odd number years, so I couldn't put in 1955. And I just, again, just almost arbitrarily took 2 years. If you'll see under the capital account, you'll see the spending includes business-forestry, $17,275 in spending.
That's correct. That's a capital item.
Yes, and if you'll see a number of lines down, there's a negative $13,860.63. That's a consumption item.
That's correct. I can read it. Yes, correct.
And under payments to individuals, there's a $9,000 amount spent. That's not capital, is it?
No, that was probably, and I'm just guessing here, I'm just looking at the numbers. There was probably enfranchisement payments or obviously payments directly to individuals.
At this point, you're guessing, you don't know.
That's correct. I didn't, you're giving me a document that I didn't prepare.
Now, if you look at column HT, you'll see the total spending, and that's an aggregate of the capital and revenue account, and you've got total spending of $143,051.19 for 1956, and the opening balance that's retained is $876,815.31. See that?
I see that.
Now, do you understand that that's for all 16 bands?
No, I don't understand that, but
Oh,
just
okay.
just give me a minute to count the number of bands at the top.
The number of bands aren't on the
Yeah,
top on this document.
No, that's correct. I was, but if you tell me that that's for all of the 16 bands, then I will accept that.
Okay. The point is, though, they're spending an awful lot less than what they have in their accounts.
That's correct. The savings in the bands was much higher than we noted in other bands. We're very surprised at the savings in the bands.
Well, that's
And those savings earn the band trust account rate.
well, that's okay. I think it's a good idea then. I think you're right about that. And I'd like to go to another demonstrative of,
Can I just catch up for a moment?
yes.
please? Go ahead.
So I've got another excerpt of trial exhibit 1-2105 tab X2B. And what I've tried to do in this document is show columns B, C, D, E, F, and G dealing with 1880, which are the very first years you looked at. And then the very last two columns, which are the totals. Oh, I apologize, sir. I did not realize you had it yet, didn't have it yet.
Can you start again then?
Yes.
And just before we leave that, as I look at these numbers, Mr. Shackler, as I mentioned, the basic idea of the capital accounts is the capital is not supposed to be touched. It's supposed to be there for the future generations of the band. And even if we look at 1954, the opening balance in the capital account was $855,000, and the closing balance was $789,000. So when we look at that, they actually spent some of their capital. They didn't maintain the capital for the future benefit of the band members. They actually spent some money out of the capital account. So in addition to the monies in so some of these, as you said, they're not savings. They're just rearrangement of the capital. The opening balance of 855 million, closing balance is down 1,000. Closing balance is down by $65,000. There was a net spending out of the capital account that wasn't capital. It went into payments to individuals, consumption, and some other elements. So when we look at that, when we look at all of the accounts, the idea is the capital account, as I said, is for the future generations of the band. And the idea is to preserve the capital for that purpose. And the spending is supposed to be the money to live on. And what we've got here is that the band actually spent money out of his capital account. It reduced the amount of his capital in 1954. And then again in 1956.
Yes.
So that's just a comment. I'm just looking at these numbers.
Right. Thank you. It's not a question I asked. It's a comment, but let's move to the next document that you now have in front of you, and what it is. It's again an excerpt of tab X2B of Exhibit 1-2105. And what I've attempted to do is to insert columns B, C, D, E, F, G, and the very last two columns, HV and HW. And I wonder, I can also advise my friends in the court that we have done this in accordance with the court's request to try and produce a document that is in compendium format. I have not changed or altered any of the data. And unless my friends object, I would, with their consent, mark it as Exhibit 1-2105.4.
Thank you very much. That's the exhibit will be so named.
Thank you. Now, what I wanted to direct you to on this particular exhibit 2105.4 is column HV. Column HV is all of the spending in both the capital and the revenue accounts. And you see that the total spending, this is over the whole period, 1880 to 1957, I believe. 56, excuse me. I'd ask you to assume that because that's what I believe the document shows. And what it shows is that over all the years, the amount actually spent was $1,849,913.10 out of both the capital and the revenue account. You see that?
I do.
And their opening balance retained is they had in total at the end that was retained is $21,618,085.05. You see that in column HV?
Yes, I do.
So again, they're not spending all of their money.
Well, if you include the capital account, they're not supposed to spend the money in the capital account.
I don't. It's not meant to be an argument. He's asking a question.
Okay.
So
well,
if you could just first answer the question.
Okay.
And then if there's something else to add, please feel free.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, on the bottom left-hand side of Exhibit 2105.4, we actually have from your own data, the portion of the accounts that was spent and the portion that was retained. And the portion that was retained was over 92% over the whole period. You see that?
I do.
That's different than the split in your report, which is close to 50-50.
That could be true, yes.
Can I just find that, please?
Yes, on exhibit 2105.4.
Yes.
The last two entries in the row, the last two row entries,
Yes,
it says both accounts spending 7.83%, both accounts retained 92.17.
thank you.
Sorry, 92.17 if I didn't say that. Thank you, Council. My point is that did someone tell you not to use the capital account, or do you know?
Nobody gave us any directions whatsoever. They told us to look at interpret economic interpretation of Judge Laskin's decision. And we said to do that, we need to have data on the trust accounts. And normally we looked at the trust accounts, all of the data that was available for every year and not for every other year. In this case, Justice agreed to fund a sample of the annual reports to help us. And we got that data, and that's what this data says. Now, you're saying something that's not correct, and you're giving an incorrect interpretation of this data. There's a difference between capital and income and spending. And you're basically looking at the total amount of spending out of capital and income, which suppose you're worth $2 million, Mr. Schachter, and your income's $100,000. And I say you, I just mean generally. If you include your capital and your income, and then next year you've still got $2 million and you've spent your $100,000, if you look at the amount of spending out of your income, it's 100%. If you look at the spending out of your capital and your income, it's 100,000 out of 2.1 million, which is a tiny percentage. And that's exactly what you've got here. For example, in 1880, the data that's here, we have the capital account of the band. That's their wealth. That's the amount that's there meant to be for the good of the current and future generations. At the end of the year, they actually didn't spend anything. All they did was the percentage on collection, I think is the fee to somebody basically when they receive some monies. So this is how we would expect it to happen. We would expect the opening and the closing balance of the capital account to be relatively similar, because the capital is not for the current generation of the band, it's for the current and all the future generations of the band. The revenue account is then the income. It's the band trust account rate applied to the balance in the capital account. So in this year, 1880, they had $599 in the revenue account, and then they spent almost all of the money that was allocated to them to spend. And the single biggest item is the payments to individuals. So this is really a simple proposition. You have capital, you earn money on the capital, which is the income of the band, and then they distributed the bulk of that income to annuities to the members of the band. When you look at the spending of this band, we're looking at how much you spend out of your income. The basic idea is the capital account shouldn't be touched. It's there for future generations. So by combining the two together, you're obviously going to bias the numbers.
I'm sorry, sir. It's not a bias, and your presumption or your assumption is incorrect. Before I took you to exhibit 2105.4, sir, you pointed out, look at all the spending in 1954 from the capital account. And in your explanation you just gave me, you told me that the capital account isn't used and it's supposed to be saved for future generations.
That's correct.
So you've given an inconsistent answer. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely incorrect. That's a false assertion.
Sir,
The capital accounts were set up for a reason. And over the time period, the ability of the bands to spend money out of the capital accounts were reduced. They allowed the Indians to take more control over the money in their capital account. And as a result, we started to see spending coming out of the capital account for a variety of different reasons. But the capital accounts, there's a reason why they're called capital accounts, Mr. Schachter, and there's a reason why they're called spending accounts. And the capital accounts are meant to be there for future generations.
All right.
Subsequently, the Indian Act was relaxed, and bans were allowed to, through a band council resolution, go to the minister to spend money out of their capital account. And that was a result of a long series of complaints on the part of the band members that the Indian Act was restricted. So you would expect to see changes over time.
Are you going to tell this court that the looking at the spending and savings in the capital account is irrelevant for this court's consideration?
I'm saying that the most important thing is we're trying to look at spending amounts out of income. That's what we look at when we look at savings. The information I gave you yesterday was from household savings and looking at savings rates out of income and looking at spending out of income. The data from the GDP is spending out of income. We're looking at how you spend money out of your income. Now, clearly, as Justice Laskin said, you sometimes spend money out of the capital account as well. Some of the capital is spent. It's meant to be spent on other capital items, but over time, the Indian Act has loosened those regulations and allowed spending out of the capital account on other items.
I'd like an answer to my question. Do you need me to repeat
You made
it?
a false assertion. I'm just explaining what.
There was a
what you-
question.
Sorry, can we go back and ask what
Back.
was the specific question?
Is it your professional opinion that the capital account spending and savings patterns in this case are irrelevant and that the judge should ignore them?
I think when we talk about, I think all data is useful and all data should be presented and all data is valuable to assist in the court. But the basic thing we're trying to look at is the spending patterns of the bands. And until relatively recently, there were restrictions on spending out of the capital account. So I can understand why Mr. Kersner focused on the spending out of the spending accounts.
So it's a little bit of a equivocal answer. I'm not sure whether your professional opinion is to tell the judge, Justice Hennessy, that she should ignore the spending patterns and saving patterns in the capital account. Can you just answer that question? Give her some guidance?
My guidance to Justice Hennessy is to look at all possible data in forming an opinion.
Okay. Yesterday, at around 12:10 p.m., you had testified as follows, and I think it was maybe taken out of context, and I want to make sure you weren't misquoted. You said, "I'd strongly recommend that you don't put money in the equity market because the amount of risk in the equity market is so great, you're more likely to lose your money than you are to actually make anything." That's what you said.
On a 1-year horizon, correct.
Pardon?
On a 1-year horizon, correct.
Right. That wasn't clear from the testimony, and I just wanted to be fair to you because you were looking at it. I think you were talking about someone who's saving to buy a house in a year. I
That's
think that
correct.
was
We were talking about saving the money for deposit for a year. Well, I wouldn't recommend somebody put money in the equity market.
right. So your comment was just for a 1-year horizon.
That's correct. The longer the time horizon, the more reason there is to invest in the equity market.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I wonder if you could help clarify what I've noted as a discrepancy about the rate used for inflation. In Exhibit 42, this was a summary sheet that was prepared by Canada Council and came into the record through Professor Booth. There's,
Professor Kersner.
I apologize, Professor Kersner. there is included in there for an average rate of inflation, 3.57%. But I had thought that in your analysis, you used 2.95%. And I think that's what appears in your paper or in your report. Can you explain the discrepancy?
In my report, I report the data from Statistics Canada from 1926 to 2000, I think it was 2020. Because that's the period when we've got stock market data and we've got returns on bonds. So the rate of inflation is not constant. The average isn't constant. So the average from 1926 to now was one number. I think Professor Kersner calculated the number since 1876, the data in the trust accounts.
So
Different time periods produce different rates of inflation. If we calculated the rate of inflation over the last year, it's 6.4%, I think.
all right, so there's nothing to be made of the different uses of 2.95 or 3.57.
No, you're just estimates of the rate of inflation over different time periods.
Sticking with Exhibit 42, I wanted to talk about the rates of return for infrastructure, business, and human capital. And am I correct that the business 8.2% is stated as a rate of return before depreciation is factored in?
No, that's the rate of return on common equities. After looking at the rate of return of investing in firms, after firms have deducted depreciation in their own financial statements, but it doesn't take into account the decay on those any investment from the point of view of investors.
Right, but Exhibit 42, in suggesting that your model provides sorry, maybe I can put it this way. The 8.2% represented there is not the net rate of return on business. That's doesn't include in the effects of depreciation.
I don't understand your question. It's
Well,
the rate of return that you earn on equity investment. So
Right,
if I invest in equity shares now and I hold them for 10 years and earn 10%, 10% is the rate of return that I earn.
right. But one way to look at Exhibit 42 is you could look at it and say, oh, well, that's not so bad. They're being very generous. They are allowing for an 8.2% rate of return for the for business. That's very generous. But the way that you calculate it in your model is you take depreciation off of the 8.2%, right?
We take depreciation off, as I explained yesterday, because when we look at the investments, that's a rate on equity investments. If we're looking at the band investing in a productive investment, then that investment will wear out. My investment in the stock market doesn't wear out. Equity investments and the TSX don't wear out, in the sense that we wouldn't take any depreciation on an investment in the TSX, because when you hold equity securities, they generally go up. So we don't depreciate equity securities, but we do depreciate investments in real business.
Yes.
So we're taking the rate of return from equities, which is the ownership of businesses, as a rate of return on any business investments undertaken by the band. Unlike equities, when I put an investment in the equity market, I don't have to compensate and give money to the firm. I got limited liability. I can just sit back. I don't have to contribute anything more into my equity shares. But if you're a business and we're going to give them an 8.2% rate of return, they will then have to maintain that physical equipment, which is what depreciation is. And in the accounts, in the trust accounts, They do not separate the original investment from the reinvestment of depreciation to maintain the value of the investment.
Sir, I'm going to put it to you that the 8.2% identified on Exhibit 42 after depreciation should show 2.8%. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely wrong. That is
I'm-
totally incorrect.
I'm going to suggest to you, sir, that the rate of return that's identified for infrastructure for 5.5 becomes 2.0, not 5.5. Do you agree with that, sir?
No, that's totally incorrect. It's
I'm-
theoretically incorrect, it's practically incorrect, it's empirically incorrect. It is totally incorrect.
I'm going to put it to you, sir, that the return of human capital of 7.5% becomes a blend of 5.6% for, excuse me. 5.6% for education. Sorry, I'm going to try that again. I'm going to put to you that human capital includes spending on education and healthcare. Do you agree with that?
I would agree that that's the way in which we combine the values, yes.
Yes. And in your data set, would you agree with me that education had a rate of return of 10%
That's correct.
and a depreciation rate of 4%?
I think that sounds correct, yes.
And would you agree with me that healthcare had a rate of return before depreciation of 5%?
That's correct.
And it had a depreciation rate of 4%?
That's correct.
And would you agree with me that business had a rate of return before depreciation of 8.2% and a depreciation rate of 5%?
That's correct. The numbers are correct. The way you interpreted them is totally incorrect.
I haven't asked a question.
Well, you already have. You gave it before you gave me those numbers.
No, okay, go ahead.
Okay, and for infrastructure, the rate before return was 5.5% and your depreciation rate was 3.3%.
Those numbers are correct, yes.
Yesterday, you proposed,
Can I, Mr.
Yes.
Schechter, can I just go
yeah,
back? Were you reading from Exhibit 42?
where I was reading from was, sorry, if you want to find the numbers that I just read to the witness, you'll find them at the Booth and Kersner report, pages 95 and 97.
Thank you.
They are, yeah, and they are also conveniently located in tab 6 of the tab 6 of the Kersner cross-examination compendium. Yes,
I would suggest, Mr. Schindler, that you might refer her on to tab 7, because those are the numbers from your expert. The numbers that you put.
no,
on
no,
this-
I want to direct it directly to Booth and Kersner's data, not
But
not
this-
my client's data.
This data is your data. that
No,
you-
no. The numbers actually come
Yeah,
from the
I
Booth and
know,
Kersner
but those
report.
are the numbers there. They're the exact same numbers. That's where you got that, and you added your own row of your own calculation with Mr. Kersner.
Oh,
was
this is
incorrect.
directly from Mr.
This-
Kersner's.
No, this is from your report, and we
No.
agree with it.
Okay, hold on. We can do this then. My friend has helpfully advised that if you look at tab 7 of the Kersner cross-examination compendium, there is a table 3.
Thank you.
And my counsel for Canada has just indicated they take no issue with that. So you can get it from table 3
Of Exhibit M.
of the Booth and of the reply report of Joseph Stiglitz and David Hutchings, page 60 of 80. Or you can get it from tab 6, where there is that summary from Booth and Kersner, page page 95 or parent.
I'm on like,
I thought Mr. Schechter was trying to
Yeah.
just tell us what you had told him. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Justice Kennedy. I'm fully content to have the numbers from Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings' report, which in fact are completely consistent with Professor Booth and Kersner's numbers. Behind tab 7, I'm fully content to have your honor.
Behind tab 7 of Exhibit M.
That's correct.
Okay,
However, Mr. Schacter's also referred you to Mr. Schacter's own markup of Exhibit 42 behind tab 6. You have that in front of you?
it actually is going to take me 1 second. All right, you're content to have table 3 from Exhibit M, page 49. Go ahead.
Is this page
So-
or paragraph?
On the document behind tab 6 of Exhibit M,
Yeah,
Yes,
that's a version of Figure 1.
yes,
You could call it also a version of Exhibit 42, but it's got Mr. Schachter's handwritten comments. It's
annotation.
also got Mr. Schachter's own numbers in the chart reproduced at the bottom.
Yes,
This is misleading because none of the experts have come up with these numbers. These are Mr. Schachter's own numbers.
okay,
But the way they're physically presented looks like they might have come from a chart, like Booth and Kersner's chart or Stiglitz and Hutchings's chart. And we know that these numbers didn't. They came from Mr. Schachter, and Mr. Kersner explained in his testimony why Mr. Schachter's numbers are incorrect. He's got the wrong equation here. Mr.
Okay.
Kersner explained that. So I'm concerned about Your Honor referring to this chart because you may.
I wasn't going there.
Great.
You were telling me to go to table 3 on page 49 behind tab 7.
That's right, and I'm happy with that, but Mr. Schachter was just indicating you could look at both, and I'm saying, look at tab 7, don't look at tab 6.
Okay, you say they're different.
Well, if you look at them, tab 6 has an additional column that is, we've heard from the witnesses is incorrect. The first two.
Right, this is the
rows,
AB, this was the ABC.
Yes,
column.
and C is Mr. Schachter's own calculation, which the witness told us was incorrect. But A and B are correct, and they are as reproduced as shown behind tab 7.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all right.
I'm just going to, this all started because I asked you what you were reading from, and so I just want to annotate my notes if I
Yeah.
can, please. So the question you put to the witness was from one of the places was the rates in table 3, page 49 of Exhibit M.
Well, I actually put to him more than that.
Okay,
I put to him that I put to him the rates before depreciation and the depreciation rate, which he agreed to. But I also put to him the effect of that depreciation rate on the real rate of return, which he disagreed with. Mr. Kersner also. But I put it to him.
and by the way, were they your column C?
Yeah, that's in column C, and
Okay,
I will save the rest for argument.
okay.
You know, maybe before we leave tab 6 of Mr. Kersner's cross-examination compendium, could we ask the witness to look at that?
I don't have it.
Yeah, we're gonna put it up on the computer for you in a moment.
So what is it you're putting up?
I'm putting up tab 6 and the third column. Exhibit M.
Go ahead.
I should be, I want to make sure I'm extra fair to the witness. You'll see at column C, there's a mathematical formula to calculate the effective real rate of return after depreciation. Do you see the formula there? I'm not going to read it out, but do you see it?
The formula 1 minus A times 1 minus B, that the formula referring to?
Yes.
I see that formula. That is incorrect.
You think that's incorrect?
I know that's incorrect. I know
Okay.
exactly what we did and we didn't do that.
And what do you say is the correct formula? Just so that the judge can understand
What
what.
we did in our analysis was, for example, for business, we classified not just the original investment in business, but everything that was spent on business, including replacement, including a new shovel, including maintenance, everything that went into that, not just the original investment, but all spending in order to maintain the asset. Because as I explained yesterday, we couldn't separate out the original investment from the actual spending. So the rate of 8.2% is correct, but it was applied not just to the original investment, but for everything spent on business, including maintenance, which you normally wouldn't include because the maintenance is there to maintain the asset. So that's the first fundamental mistake in that equation. The second is that's a real rate. And we took 1.082, for example, for business and multiplied by 1 plus the rate of inflation. So last year that would have been multiplied by 1.64. So that would have meant about 15% for the amount included in the business account. And then we took depreciation on that amount, not on the real amount. We took depreciation on the nominal amount because depreciation is taken on nominal, not real amounts. So the whole structure of that exhibit, first of all, it's not what we did. And secondly, it seems to apply to just the original cost of the investment, the original investment in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, without taking into account all the amounts of money that we included as maintenance, but we couldn't separate in the trust accounts.
Yeah, I think you're trying to defend your position, but that's not what I'm asking you to do.
You
I'm
asked
simply-
me whether I accepted that equation, and I don't. It's wrong.
No, I thought I asked you, and I apologize if I didn't. The record will show what I asked you, but are you able to provide the court with some guidance on a formula that is correct if the one that is in column C is incorrect?
If the one in column C is incorrect, and you start out with
Just go to the end of the question. Do you have a formula that you recommend?
I could recommend a formula, yes. I
That was the
would say
question.
exactly what we did, yes.
Yes, I'd just like to write down the formula.
It would be 1 plus D times 1.082 times 1 plus the inflation rate times 1 minus D.
Thank you, sir.
That's what we did.
That wasn't so hard, was it?
I just explained what we did and you asked me in words. If you asked me for a new formula, I would have given it to you.
All right. Thank you so kindly. I wonder then if we could move on to some of your testimony yesterday involving the Great Depression of and the stock market crash of 1929. Do you recall talking about that
I
yesterday?
do.
And as I recall it, and perhaps I'm paraphrasing, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. But you were identifying that one of the things you have to do as an economist or an investor or a financial advisor is you have to see what the band's spending patterns are to see if they can ride out a downturn in the stock market. Do you remember talking about that?
That's correct. I would say that that's general for anybody. The first thing you do in investment is know your client. You understand your client's needs, their spending commitments, and then you develop a financial plan.
So in your analysis, did you look at the spending pattern of Red Rock First Nation, my client, to see if they could withstand the stock market crash of 1929?
No, because we weren't asked to do that.
Well, but you need to do that in order to figure out what investment is appropriate for them, don't you?
If I was hired as their financial advisor at the current point in time, that's exactly what I would do.
All right, well, let's take a look at some data. And we're going to wait till we hand that up. Now, what we have, I've handed up two sheets. One is table 17 from the expert report of David Hutchings, which is exhibit 8, which is the nominal net crown revenues, including spectrum net revenues from 1850 to 2019. And the second page of the second document is actually an excerpt of trial exhibit 1-2105, schedule 1, spreadsheet 1 for the years 1926 through 1934 for Red Rock.
Should these be two separate documents?
Yeah, they should be. I think they should be two separate documents.
Got it. Thank you.
Now, if my friends have no objection, perhaps we can mark the excerpt of exhibit 8 as exhibit 8.1.
The report from Hutchings was exhibit 8.
Yes. Do you want to mark it as 8.1 or do we need to mark it at all? What would the court prefer?
It's close at hand, anything that's a report in this file, in this trial.
Yeah.
Have you two figured it out?
Sorry?
I was just.
You know, I am going to say it, that the numbers have changed.
Yes.
Yes, yes,
In table 17?
yes.
Oh,
Yeah, in table 17, the numbers changed, not dramatically. But the reason why I've got it included here is because the witness would not have had an opportunity to review the new numbers. And he and Mr. Kersner would have been working from the old numbers.
oh, so this is from the predecessor to the report that actually became the exhibit.
No, it's part of exhibit 8, but you might recall in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings updated his data. He updated it in July and then he updated it in February as well. And that's in the record.
Right, he updated it, but what became exhibit 8? The updates? The updated? Oh, I see.
Yeah, and this is just part of his original main report with the numbers that are not updated.
Okay, so Ms. Evans,
Yeah, I would just like to say I'm perfectly happy to have Mr. Schachter refer to this document from exhibit 8.
yes,
But it should be noted that it's helpful for illustrative purposes, as my friend has said, but the court should not rely on this document as though it's an accurate representation of what Mr. Hutchings says.
Oh.
Net crown resource revenue.
numbers were later updated.
Twice, they've been updated.
Yeah.
So these numbers are no longer ones that the court should be using for making any calculations, but they are useful for.
The court will do its best not to make any calculations.
It
I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, sure, but I don't want the court to be misled that these numbers are accurate. They're not.
You see, and here I was thinking that if I use the updated numbers, Ms. Lewis and I had a discussion about this. If I use the updated numbers, it would be unfair to the witness because he hasn't seen them yet. And so I was.
Unfairness has its limits. All right, so then, so what I have before me is an excerpt from exhibit 8.
Yes,
And I will note on it, and let's note it on the record, that these numbers were updated by Mr. Hutchings in his evidence.
the second document is a compendium version of columns A, B, C, D, and E of 1-2105 for the years 1926 through 1934 for the Red Rock Band. Oh, thank you. Yes.
I'm sure you won't be able to answer this question, Mr. Schachter, but Ms. Lewis probably can. Which,
Oh. Don't be so presumptuous.
which sheet in the spreadsheet does this come from?
It says spreadsheet 1 at
Yes,
the
that's
data
what it
source. Yes, the data source.
Source that.
And I'll have everyone know that I could have answered that.
I'm sorry,
The end of many weeks, Mr.
All right.
Sir. Okay,
So can we mark that excerpt of 1-2105 as 1-2105.5?
And I would guess that we indicate on here that it comes from the source data sheet, because there are so many
Yes,
sheets. in
yes.
that spreadsheet.
Yes, I think that's that. Thank you, counsel. So excerpt of trial exhibit 1-2105 from the data source tab, source data tab of spreadsheet 1. Now, Professor Booth, if you could have those two documents just in front of you at the same time. Yesterday, I believe you indicated that you didn't know what the share of the wealth, share of the NCRRs would be that would go to the Anishinaabe.
That's correct.
And I had asked you whether you have, well, maybe I should ask it again. You did not, in your analysis, consider Stiglitz and Hutchings' view that 84% of the net Crown Resource revenues would go to the Anishinaabe?
That's correct. That's the decision of this court. I have no idea what a fair allocation is. I'm not necessarily going to agree with the plaintiffs. I'm not going to disagree with the plaintiffs. I have no idea what that allocation will be.
Would you at least agree with me that in order to assess whether or not the First Nation could withstand the Great Depression in terms of cash flow, you would have to look at what their spending was?
Well, we know what the spending was. The question that I addressed yesterday was what would have happened if they put the money in the stock market? What would have happened? So I can see the data that you presented me on their actual spending. That is factual. I assume this comes from the Ernst & Young data, and I'm assuming it's accurate.
And if you'll note, in each year, there's interest earned. Do you know where that interest is coming from?
Well, presumably it comes from the capital account.
Mm-hmm. And with the interest increasing each year, are you able to say whether the capital account is growing?
Well, assuming that the band trust account rate was exactly the same, increasing interest indicates increasing capital.
Mm-hmm.
Did, I missed something? Did you answer the question in order to assess whether or not the First Nation could withstand the Great Depression? In terms of cash flow, you would have to look at their spending?
That's correct.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
There were subsequent questions.
Yeah.
I got those. Thank you.
Would you agree with me, sir, that Red Rock First Nation, as an example on exhibit 2105.5, doesn't look like they needed much money during the period 1926 to 1934?
Well, if I look at the numbers, I can see that the opening balance plus the government interest equals the closing balance for 1928. And it seems to be the same for 1930. And it seems to be the same for 1932. It seems to be that there's no spending on the part of the Red Rock Band, that everything was saved and everything earned the band trust account rate.
So Red Rock, for example, based on their spending patterns, didn't need to call on capital at all.
Well, I don't know how they survived. I don't know what they spent their money on. But from this data, they didn't actually spend any money, didn't distribute any money to the individual members of the band.
Well, except for what in 1926, before the Depression, they
Sorry, yes, there's,
$18.97.
yeah, that's relief. That was obviously, the band was in a bad situation and they distributed money as relief. But for the particular years of after the stock market crash and the Depression, it appears from this data that they didn't distribute any money to the members of the band to live on.
Yesterday at around 4:45 p.m., you explained to me that economics has fairness written all over it.
That's correct.
Remember that?
Yep.
Your report, I take it, is not simply a mathematical model of implementing what you understood Justice Laskin's words to mean in Whitefish. Your report is also a product of what you believe is fair then? Is that true?
No, that's not true. When I said that economics has fairness all over it, it's because there's what we call the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which is the prices in the market reflect the value that people place on them. And that is fairness. It's basically the first, as I said, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics and the first principle of a functioning financial market. So the first thing that we learn in welfare economics is the efficiency of a financial market or an economic market.
So really what you're saying is that in your analysis, fairness, justice, liberality, benevolence are foreign concepts. Is that true?
I would say that we have tried, well, let's perhaps refer to one of the documents that you sent me yesterday, where I explained this to, I think, to Justice Whalen, that we regarded ourselves as a workmanlike interpretation of Justice Laskin, and that there are problems that we weren't sure that Justice Laskin understood if you followed his judgment. And we said that there could be ethical problems in this. And I have ethical concerns like everybody else. In terms of presenting our evidence, we tried hard not to impose our ethical values on our interpretation of Justice Laskin's decision. And instead, we've drawn attention to the court in every hearing we've been in, that there are propositions that follow from this that we personally don't like in terms of our ethical values, but that hasn't affected our interpretation of the decision of the Court of Appeals. Because that's not our prerogative. That's the prerogative of the court to impose ethical values on fairness, not us.
In your report, at footnote 41 on page 30, exhibit 38. Footnote 41 says, our estimate of compensation is purely an economic one.
That's correct.
And
Subject to the decision.
I haven't
how-
asked a question.
Sorry.
You stand by that statement?
Can you say it again without any qualifications?
At page 30, footnote 41. The words. Your words are, our estimate of compensation is purely an economic one. Do you stand by that statement?
Correct. Subject to, as an economic interpretation of Justice Laskin's decision and what we read into the decision in Southwind.
Would you agree with me, sir, that when you say that it's only an economic interpretation, you do not make any moral judgments whatsoever about what is fair?
That's correct. In fact, we've highlighted the possibility that it's unfair in every case that we've been involved in.
And
Particularly in the Williams Treaty ones, where we had to deal with 7 bands, all of which had different patterns of savings and spending. And the net result would be that they get different compensation, even though they're subject to the same breach by the Crown, which we regarded as a dilemma, a moral dilemma.
and that's a dilemma, a problem with your model?
No, it's our, you keep saying our model. It is our model in the sense that we're trying to interpret Justice Laskin's decision. But if you ask me how to bring forward the monies, we haven't given our view of what is a moral value in terms of compensation.
That's right. In Alderville, you just finished telling me in the court that in Alderville, there were 7 different bands and there were 7 different savings and data.
That's correct.
And so the problem was that you have to look at each band individually and you end up with different results.
That's correct.
You didn't do that in this case.
Because we don't have the problem of 7 different bands and 7 different amounts of spending that we were asked to look at. We were asked to look at a sample of the spending on the part of the bands. If we had done that, our concerns would be amplified in terms of the moral implications of trying to implement Justice Laskin's decision.
Is it fair to say that in your analysis, what you're trying to do is interpret what Justice Laskin said essentially in a relatively mechanical manner?
Yep, that's exactly what we said. I said to Justice Whalen.
Yes. And is it correct to say if that I shouldn't ask you whether you think it leads to results that are fair, because that's not the question?
If that's the transcript, then that's correct. I can't remember
Perhaps you
everything
can
that I
take a
said.
look at tab 1 compendium and paragraph 310 of Hawaii.
Can I get that citation again, Nelson?
Yes, Hawaii.
Paragraph.
Oh, paragraph 310 of Hawaii, which is found at tab 1 of the compendium, exhibit N as in Nathan. And paragraph 310 appears on page 5 of the compendium. And there's excerpts of the transcripts where you testified. You see paragraph 310?
That's correct.
Let's just get this into the record. It says, don't ask me whether I think it leads to results that I think are fair, because that's not the question. You
That's
see that?
correct. I've not tried to impose my opinions of what is fair at any stage in any hearing. That presumes the responsibility of the court, which is to determine what is fair. All we tried to do is do a mechanical calculation, trying to implement the Whitefish Court of Appeals decision and lay out benchmarks in terms of rates of return and lay out the problems and alert the court to that in our view, there are some moral problems, some ethical problems. if there's a breach by the Crown in terms of treatment of Williams treaty, as there was, we found it difficult to believe that if you actually take the circumstances of the band into account, the way directed by Justice Laskin, you lead to different compensation for different bands. And we think that's a moral problem. It's an ethical problem. And we alerted the court in that hearing to that problem.
So in your analysis, in your work, considerations of morality, justness, liberality, and benevolence do not come into play.
That's correct. I have my views on that, but I'm not going to tell the court those views because I'm not an expert.
Then we don't need to go there.
In ethics.
Just work with the question.
At footnote 44 of, oh, I'm sorry, it's 11:30. How long would the court like to go for? I probably have another half hour to 45 minutes of cross-examination.
Good. Okay, so we'll take a break. 15 minutes.
This court will recess for 15 minutes.
In stereo.
Resuming at 11:40. Sorry.
In stereo.
We're all right.
This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Professor Booth, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how the band trust accounts work, and at page 31 and footnote 44 of your report.
Council, I'm sorry, Council, I'm having a technical issue. All of a sudden, John, I apologize.
Okay, we'll just take a minute.
Yeah. We're ready to begin?
Let's go.
Okay, so at page 31 and footnote 44 of your report, you identify a good description about how these accounts work. That's the trust accounts. Is found in Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, Evaluation of Indian Monies, Estates and Treaty Annuities, April 2013. You're familiar with that document?
Yes.
Perhaps you can take a look at some excerpts from that document at tab 5 of the compendium that I provided. Now, the whole document is Trial Exhibit 1-2129. You reference that at footnote 44 of page 31 of Exhibit 38, which is your main report. And I just wanted to read from the document and see if you can provide the court with some guidance. Now, it says in the early, under paragraph 3.1.1 at page 20 of the compendium, under the heading Band Monies. Do you see 3.1.1 background and description?
I do.
And in the second paragraph, the authors write, in the early 19th century, Indian and band monies were invested in England. You're familiar with that?
That's correct.
And the next sentence says, these funds were later transferred to Canada and invested in various securities such as provincial bonds, municipal loan bond funds, and Grand River Navigation Company stock. See that?
I do.
Do you understand that to be correct too?
I know that the band that invested in the Grand River Navigation Company, and they invested in both the company's shares and also in some of the company's debt.
The
And
second,
that company went bankrupt, as you're probably aware.
so a bad investment.
Very bad investment. They lost about 25% of the value of their portfolio, something of that order.
No diversification, I take it.
Well, they do no diversification in terms of their equity investments or their risk investments. That's correct. They did have diversification in terms of lending money. They actually still had money lent to the UK, invested in consols, as well as investing in the province of Canada, and as well as investing in, I think it was Haldimand City, some of the municipal debt in Ontario.
Mhm. I wonder, sir, if you could look at the last paragraph on page 20 of the compendium starting with the words despite. Do you see the paragraph starting with the words despite federal interest?
That's correct.
It says despite federal interest in protecting capital, comma, by the late 19th century, that's the end of the 1800s, right?
That's correct.
Banned capital and revenue monies were being used to support the growing expenses of the Indian Department and the federal government's civilization program. You're aware that that took place?
I'm aware of the active involvement in the India Department, correct?
And in the second last line of that paragraph, after the footnote 12, the following appears. An amendment to the Indian Act in 1918 allowed expenditure of banned money without banned consent. Period. Over time, monies were used to support capital projects, education, including residential schools, the purchase of agricultural implements, salaries for Indian Department officials, and the purchase of goods. See that there?
That's correct.
So one of the problems in looking at spending is we don't know what was being spent with the consent of the First Nations and what was being spent at the behest of Canada. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely correct.
That changed, do you say that changed in 1951 when the minister could no longer authorize capital and revenue expenditures without the band council consent?
I would accept that, correct?
And your data is from 1950, sorry, your data goes up to 1956, is that
That's
correct?
correct.
Can I just ask a question? It's from your very first question on this series. When you talked about investing in 19th century, money was invested. Were the First Nations doing that directly, or was the government doing that on their behalf? Because I thought you had said, sir, that what was in the band accounts, or certainly the interest from the band accounts, was financed.
This is before the band trust accounts. Throughout the 18th century, the 1700s, into the early 19th century, there were no government trust accounts. My understanding is that if there were land sales, for example, that the proceeds would go into a trust, a traditional trust, administered by a private trustee and invested on behalf of the band by that trustee. And it was that trustee's decision to invest, for example, in as it states here, the Grand River Navigation Company that eventually went bankrupt.
And the trustee was taking instructions from whom?
That's a very good question.
That's not known.
I can't answer that. My understanding is that is a subject of litigation in
Okay.
terms of exactly what happened with those monies.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping not to look for new information, but just trying to understand how that fit in with other evidence. That's helpful. Thank you.
Over on page 22 of the compendium, the authors in this 2013 article, in the second paragraph on the page, 6 lines down towards the end, the sentence reads, capital and revenue monies represent a source of funds that could be used for economic development. Given the importance of economic development to the future of First Nations, band monies could permit quicker access to funds to allow for more timely response to emerging opportunities. While quick access to band's monies has been achieved for revenue expenditures, which account for approximately 30% of total expenditures, the remaining 70% of capital expenditures fall under 64 of the Indian Act. You see that there?
I do.
So am I correct in understanding that approximately 70% of expenditures come from capital, not from revenue?
Your understanding of that is the same as mine. That's what, they don't give any reference to what bands they were or what time period. But capital, the bands are entitled, there's stricter controls over the capital, because the capital, as I've mentioned several times, is for the future generations of the band.
Yes.
So the governance is basically to make sure that any spending on capital is for capital items such as railways, well, not railways, roads, and physical buildings. So you're swapping one capital for another capital, and the band is not sort of spending all the money on consumption goods for the benefit of the existing band members and not doing what is supposed to be for the future members of the band.
Thank
So
you.
there's 70% there. I mean, it's just a reference there. There's no backup in terms of the underlying data, when it refers to. So your understanding of that is exactly the same as mine.
I wonder if we could talk about the Monte Carlo method. Yesterday you talked about the Monte Carlo method, and I just want to try and understand it a little bit better, because if I go into the Monte Carlo casino and if I bet $100 on a coin toss, there's great volatility in that, because statistically, is it about 50% that I'll lose if I choose heads?
No, it's less than that. Sorry, it's because it depends how many zeros there are on the roulette wheel. If you're talking about spinning a roulette wheel.
No, I'm flipping a coin.
Flipping a coin.
I'm presuming it can only come up heads or tails. I suppose theoretically it could land on its side.
That's correct. If you and I gambled, it would be 50-50.
Right.
If it's in a casino, they have to cover all of their costs, and whatever bet there is, the house wins.
Yes, and that's the principle of blackjack, where if you play enough hands, you'll approach the house edge, but you'll never get over the house edge.
Well, that otherwise casinos wouldn't exist. I mean, somebody has to pay for all of the salaries of the people in the casino and the building and everything.
But the point I'm trying to get at is that as you flip the coin more and more, the volatility of expectation is I'm not sure if this is the right economic terms, but your expectations of outcome become more certain, and the volatility becomes less. Is that true?
That's correct. Assuming that you're tossing the same coin, or it's the same roulette wheel over and over and over and over again, eventually you'll end up with the probability of a heads being 0.5.
Right.
But clearly, I mean, if I toss a coin now, it could be tails. And you say, well, the coin is rigged. It's a fake coin. It turned up tails. That's all I've got. It's the tails.
Yeah.
If you do it twice and you get 2 tails, then you say, well, I think this is a rigged coin. The probability of that happening is 1/4, and yet it's just happened. So if you do it 3 times, the probability is 1/8.
And it wouldn't matter if I was using a nickel instead of a quarter?
Doesn't matter in terms of the coin toss. But all I'm saying is the more times you toss it, the more times it comes down tails, then you're going to say, okay, I give up. This is not a fair coin. You put a little bit of metal or whatever on one side of the coin, and as a result, it's not a fair game.
Yeah, but we're talking about a fair game we're talking about really volatility and variance. Right? It's the issue of volatility.
Yep.
So if you're only investing in if you're a one person investing one time, you suffer great volatility in the stock market. But if you're many people investing over a long horizon, the volatility goes down.
It doesn't go down, but the probability of beating the risk-free rate goes up.
Right.
The uncertainty surrounding your future income basically stays the same. But the probability, but over periods of time, if the risk premium is 5%, you're basically betting that the 5% eventually will work through the volatility in equity returns, for example. So that if you ask me, am I going to beat the bond rate next year? I would say it's probably 50%, 52% probability of beating the return on a long bond. If you ask me what's the probability of beating the return on a long bond in 20 years, I would say, oh, it's more likely 85, 90%, because the risk premium,
Yes.
the fact you get a higher rate of return on equity works through the longer you invest.
Right.
So the investment horizon is absolutely critical. As I said to Your Honor yesterday, if you're investing in the equity market for a deposit for buying a house, you're taking a huge amount of risk, because the probability of beating the risk-free rate over the next year is just slightly better than a coin toss, 52%, 53%. I would never recommend anybody invest in the equity market unless their horizon is at least 5 years. That's
Thank
a
you, sir.
minimum.
I have only two more areas of questioning. The first one is depreciation. We're going to have some discussion here, and I'm going to go to a hypothetical, because the hypothetical is, for me, a way to help me understand economic stuff. So let's say that an Indian band has $100. The Indian band decides to invest in the TSX.
Okay.
Magically, it can invest in every single possible stock. Now, according to your slide 48, they would get over the long term a 9.7% compound rate of return. Is that right?
I'll take that number. It's about that number.
And it's not only about it, it's exactly that.
Okay, well, but but I
Yes,
say,
it's from your slide deck if you want to check.
Yeah.
no, I don't. Okay, but the
I don't want,
but
I'm
that's
not trying to trick you.
no, I know, but this is not what is expected, is what has happened.
Yes,
The realization of the return.
this
on
is
the
just a
equity.
hypothetical.
Yep, okay.
So would you agree with me that when if I sell my stock at the end of 1 year, then, and if the stock price hasn't gone down, and if I get a dividend of $9.70, I'm left with $1.0970 in my pocket?
That's right. I mean, it wouldn't be a dividend, it would be the total return. You'd get a capital gain and a dividend, but that's a semantic difference.
Yeah, no, but thank you for that. So I'm left with $109.70, and my rate of return has been 9.7% for that 1 year.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, when we look at my rate of return there, there's no basis to deduct any depreciation from the companies I invested in.
That's correct.
So if the $100 had been in IBM, IBM may depreciate photocopying machines, but that doesn't matter because I've invested in their stock.
That's correct. And we don't deduct depreciation from securities.
Okay. Now I have a second scenario. The band has $100 again, but this time it spends $100 on some farm equipment. Let's say a tractor. the farm equipment is put to work and makes money for the band. First question. What is the band's return on investment after depreciation at the end of 1 year? Can you tell me?
Well, we allocate, I think it's the real rate of return of 8.34%.
No, I'm asking for a hypothetical.
What is
In
the
my
rate?
hypothetical here, can you tell me, with the information I've given you, what their rate of return is after depreciation?
We use the equity rate of return that,
This isn't about your model. This is about economic theory. With the information of $100 being invested in a tractor and with the tractor being put to work to make money for the band, can you tell me what their return on investment after depreciation is at the end of the year?
on that tractor,
Yeah,
I don't know the specific rate of return on a tractor, no.
right. So you need to know the rate of return. You also need to know the depreciation rate, correct?
That's correct.
If I give you that data, then you can calculate the rate of return, correct?
Now, if you tell me the rate of return on that tractor is 10% and it depreciates by 5%, yes, I can tell you what the productive use, the productive use of that tractor and what it's going to look like at the end of the year.
It is not, in economic terms, a fair assumption to simply assume that the depreciation rate on the tractor is 5%, is it?
No, I think on a tractor, as I've said, we have the statistics on the depreciation rates in my appendix and all different types of equipment.
Right, so you'd have to go and actually look and see what that particular asset's depreciation rate is.
That's correct.
And at the same time, without looking to see what that machinery, the tractor, actually earned, there's no basis to assume that it earned 8.2%.
We use 8.2% for all business operations, because not a tractor, but all business operations.
In my hypothetical model, you just can't say 8.2%. You'd have to actually look to see what the tractor earned.
That's correct. I mean, if you go to that link, we'd have to look at all the actual industrial activity performed by the bands and work out every piece of equipment they had, and then work out a depreciation for that piece of equipment and see whether we could get a rate of return on that piece of equipment.
All right, and you didn't do that for your analysis.
No, it's impossible.
Well, it would be a lot of work. I don't know if it's impossible.
Well, put it this way, we can get depreciation rates because we need them for tax purposes. So we have lots of data on depreciation rates. We don't have a lot of data on the rate of return of using a tractor.
Would you agree with me that an 8.2% rate of return has nothing to do with the real rate of return in the real world on farming implements?
That's correct.
Now, at page 95 of your report, you calculated 8.2% as a premium above the average real rate of return earned on Canadian equities since 1923, which you identify as 6.86%. Correct?
Or can you say that again?
Well, we can go to your page 95.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That would be good.
Yeah, let's take a moment. So under summary of rates of return, under business investments, you say an 8.2% rate of return, which was a premium above the real rate of return equities, probably
Yeah,
the
I think-
return on equities.
Yeah, the 8.2% rate of return is the arithmetic mean rate of return.
Right, and the footnote says that the average real rate of return earned on Canadian equities since 1923 was 6.86%. So that's all I just referenced.
Okay, no, that's fine.
All right. But the premium that you took could have been 10%, could have been 20%, could have been 30%. It would depend if you actually wanted to look at each asset class, it would depend on what that piece of machinery actually earned, not on the equity rate.
That's correct. We're using, for business investment, we're using the return on business, which is the equity return, the return, equity holders invest in the business.
Can you go to page 97 of your report, please, sir? Page 97 has an appendix table 8.1 on it. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And there's various different rates of depreciation. And if I suggest to you that it seems to go anywhere from about 9% to 27%. Would you agree with me?
That's correct. Different sorts of equipment wears out differently.
Right.
Even if you take a car, different cars unfortunately wear out differently.
Would you, let's use, construction machinery as an example, because I want to try and understand this in economic terms. If you see construction machinery rate of return, depreciation, it's about 20 to 24% of the last column.
Yeah, I'll accept that.
Okay. Now, are you familiar with a company known as PCL Construction? Ever heard of it?
I think I've seen PCL on trucks, but
Yeah.
that's about it, I'm afraid.
All right, it just happens to be, I just chose the largest construction company in Canada.
Yep, okay.
At least that's what Mr. Internet says. The point is that they're in business, and in order for them to stay in business, you would agree that their rate of return has to be enough to cover the depreciation that they take each year.
That's right. The depreciation is a cost of business, exactly the same as labor and fuel and business expenses and everything else.
And the proper rate of return for a construction machinery company might be more than 8.2% to cover its expenses.
That's correct. Different firms have different rates of return, basically as a result of the risk that they face in their business operations.
Thank you, sir. My final point of questioning is thankfully something I think that you and I both agree with. And we're going to turn to your expert testimony in the Sampson case. Now, in your compendium, you will find at tab 6 something entitled Rebuttal Report of Laurence Booth dated August 9th, 2001, witness for the Sampson plaintiffs. On the second page of that document, page 24 of tab 6, there's your name and your signature. I take it that's your signature.
That is me.
Do you recognize this opinion rebuttal report?
I do.
And at tab 7, there's in the very same case, there is a surrebuttal report of Laurence Booth dated November 1, 2001. And then the page following, there's a signature on top of the words Laurence Booth. Do you recognize this report?
I do. My signature's a lot better than it is now, but I recognize it.
All right. So I would like to have the rebuttal report of Laurence Booth dated August 9th, 2001, marked as an exhibit in this cause. And we have provided to the court fresh copies of the documents so that we don't have to rip them out of the compendium.
So this is both tabs 6 and 7?
No, I thought Well, what's the court's preference?
But I'm just saying from what, they are tab 6 and 7 in this compendium,
Yes,
and
yeah,
you're making them exhibits.
yes.
Got it.
So tab 6 from the compendium would be exhibit. I'm looking for a number.
You'll get it soon.
Exhibit 45, people are whispering.
I
Jessica,
can confirm, exhibit 45.
All right.
Thank you.
And I would suspect that the very next one would be exhibit 46 for the rebuttal report of Laurence Booth dated November 1, 2001. Exhibit 46. Now, Professor Booth, I want to take you to certain portions of this account, of exhibits 45 and 46, because much of what you've testified over the last couple of days are consistent with what you said in the Sampson case. And I appreciate, I think maybe yesterday you said that the Supreme Court of Canada didn't accept it. Did you
That's
say
my
that?
understanding.
Well, just to be fair to you, there were legal constraints that the Supreme Court of Canada felt it was under about how the money could be used in the Sampson case. So they didn't reject your opinion.
Oh, I'm very happy to hear that, Mr. Schachter. I was under the impression they rejected my opinion.
They said that there were legal constraints on what Canada could do with the money. And it's for that reason that they went with whatever they went with. But I don't recall from my reading of the Supreme Court of Canada case that your opinion was wrong or considered wrong by the Supreme Court of Canada. And I wanted to just canvass what I consider to be important parts of your testimony that might be helpful to the court here.
Can I just qualify?
Yeah.
My testimony at that point was that the Crown was benign neglect. They
Yes.
did what was in the Indian Act.
Yes.
And the Sampson and Ermineskin, as I said yesterday, their reserve had an elephant, a gusher of oil and gas reserves.
Yeah.
And they were about 80 to 90% of all the money. They became 80 to 90% of all the money in the Indian monies account. And it's absolutely true. They were constrained by the Indian Act, but Parliament can change the Indian Act.
Yes.
It was up to Parliament to decide. And if and my judgment at that time was that given the fact the amount of money involved in the Sampson and Ermineskin was such a huge amount of money that they were a policy of benign neglect was not satisfactory. In a trust-like relationship, the Ministry of Indian Affairs could have gone to Cabinet and said, look, we've got a problem. We're going to have to change the Indian Act. We're going to have to, we've got responsibilities here beyond the Indian Act. So they were constrained by legislation, but that's Parliament. Parliament makes legislation, unless I'm totally naive about that.
Okay. But the issue was, and what you were facing in the Sampson case was a band getting a gusher, you called it a gusher of cash.
$670 million.
That's a lot of money, $670 million.
And you would think the Indian Affairs.
I think there was just a question coming.
Sorry.
That's a lot of money. Yes?
Yes.
And I'm going to suggest to you that the amount of the net Crown resource revenues that the Anishinaabe in this case would have received in a timely fashion would also be significant. And you don't have to agree with that because you don't know how much they would have received. But I'm just going to, for the next series of questions, I am going to be assuming, and I'm going to try and convince the judge at the end of the day that it was a lot of money. And the question that I'm trying to get at is, what should have happened? What is the lost opportunity? And that's what we're trying to figure out. And you had a plan for the Sampson case that I thought was.
You say nice
Insightful.
things about me, Mr.
Yeah, I know, it's,
He's holding back.
I thought it was insightful. Let's turn to page 31 of the compendium. In the middle of the page,
Is this one of the new exhibits?
yes, this is part of Exhibit 45. Exhibit 45, I guess it would be page 7. Let's reference the exhibit page number. I'll wait till you get there.
I don't mind if you use the compendium one, frankly.
Okay,
It's,
I will try and do both. I think it'll read better on the transcript if we refer to the trial exhibit, but,
okay.
okay, so the pagination in the trial exhibit. Anyways, on Exhibit 45, page 7, I'll try and make reference to the compendium, page 31. In the middle of the page, there is the following appears. The 60/40 average split in terms of asset mix is typical for endowment funds facing the same type of problem as the bands. The actual mix at any point in time will vary with general business conditions, but many would argue for a higher average equity component. For example, Thaler and Williamson argued for 100% common equities. And that's what you wrote in that case.
That's correct.
And never mind what Thaler and Williamson said. Your opinion was 60/40 split would be appropriate for a band that has a lot of money like the Sampson band?
In 1975, yes.
What was in 75 when you wrote it, or when
No,
it
no,
happened?
I think it was 75 or 76 when Indian oil and gas, they did a review of I forget where it is in my report, of the Sampson and Emerson property and said, we've looked at this, there's a reserve here on the lands and they've got until 2020, I think it's $640 million worth of reserve. So at that stage, as I say, somewhere in here, it's like somebody with $1,000 suddenly winning a lottery. And the Sampson and Emerson band won the lottery, $640 million. And what was appropriate under the Indian Act, say for $1,000, is not appropriate under in my view, when they win the lottery and they've got an oil and gas reserve of $640 million. So what I tried to do, as I say here, without looking at hindsight, without knowing what happened, put myself in the position of what we knew at the time when the government realized this band was sitting on, had won the lottery and had won an elephant of an oil and gas field worth $640 million.
Mm-hmm. This was in the 1980s, I take it?
Yeah, I think the original discovery of the I thought I'd marked it up last night, but it's on page 18. I say it's very important to put ourselves back into the mindset of a 1975 professional fund manager to judge what would have been reasonable, and then I italicize it at that time.
Yes.
You can't use hindsight and look at these things and say, well, I know that 60/40 or whatever you want to do is reasonable now. You have to go back and say, what was reasonable at the time when the Crown should have realized that Sampson and Erskine had a problem. And that's why I went back. And if you read this carefully, you'll see that I tried to look at all of this situation as of the mid-1970s as to what was reasonable.
Right.
And I didn't try to use hindsight, what we know now.
Right. So the proper question then to ask then is, without the benefit of foresight in 1855, 1856 in this case, what would a reasonable person have done with the money?
That's exactly right.
Thank you. But would you agree with me that if the person, sorry, let me put it this way. You make the reference earlier yesterday about the analogy to an endowment fund. When
That's correct.
when I suggested, well, like pensions, you said, no, it's really more like an endowment.
Yep.
Do you have any information to help the court or any guidance for the court in terms of investment policies and sustainable withdrawal policies back in the 1850s, 1860s? Is there any way you
No.
can help us?
No idea. You've got to understand, Mr. Schachter, that you can't take today and say, well, what we know about today, let's just put it back into 1850. As you said, we have to look at what was available in 1850. And we do know that reasonable people invested in bonds in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s. That was what was regarded as legitimate investment. People didn't, by and large, invest in equities. They were regarded as speculative, because we're in a period when there was no securities regulations and there was no SEC, there was no Ontario Securities Commission. In fact, until 1855, simply incorporating wasn't a right, and a lot of the companies were unincorporated. Which meant,
Sir, I thought you told us you couldn't help us with it, and now you're giving us your opinion about what happened. You told us, I thought, that you don't know how the endowment funds invested.
no, I don't even know whether there were any endowment funds. But what I'm telling you is you can't take the current situation and project it back there and say 60-40 portfolio or anything else.
Let's turn to page 20 of Exhibit 45, page 44 of the compendium, sustainable, under the heading Sustainable Withdrawal Policy. Now, in your report in 2001, you were looking back with hindsight as to what Canada did by investing in 100% super treasury bill strategy. You see that?
That's correct. That's what I called the band trust account rate.
Yes. In this report, in your report for this case, you called it a super treasury bill.
Because it is a super treasury bill.
Okay. So you say, I have already shown that 100% super treasury bill strategy would have been extremely risky for the band's capital account, since with significant inflation, it fails to preserve the real value of the portfolio and encourages unsustainable levels. However, there are other dimensions to the risk. Now, would you agree with me that a super treasury bill strategy in this case is equally problematic if greater returns can be obtained following in the year 1980? I mean, we're putting
No.
ourselves, it's a hypothetical.
No, it's, so I'd say no. You've got to remember, what is appropriate at one point in time is not appropriate at another. The situation in the 1970s was one of significant inflation. So when we looked at the band trust account rate at that time, the super treasury bill rate, that was barely exceeding the rate of inflation. So the real rate of return in the 70s into the 80s was zero. So effectively, what the government was doing, which I thought was not acceptable, was they were transferring a nominal rate for the bands to spend when the real rate was zero. And as a result, the capital value of the capital account was going down with time. So that was very specific to the situation in the 1970s into the 1980s, when it basically is a zero real interest rate.
So what I was trying to position you with was the situation of the Anishinaabe in this case in 1980, not 1850.
Okay, so if I was hired by the Anishinaabe in 1980,
Yeah.
and they said, well, Professor Booth, well, they wouldn't have seen my Samson and Erskine at that time, but we'd like you to appear and provide expert witness on how to manage our money. And by the way, we've got $300 million or whatever. I would not have told them to invest in a super treasury bill. I would have told them exactly the same as Samson and Erskine. You need professional investment management, and which actually they have right now. They've got their own trust companies and they've got professional management.
The Anishinaabe or Samson?
No, Samson and Erskine.
Well, some of the Anishinaabe do as well now,
Well,
but let's turn to page 22 of Exhibit 45, page 46 of the compendium. And you make an interesting point that if a retiree can cope with up to 75% common equities, but can only withdraw 4% per year, what about an endowment fund? This question was examined by Spitz et al. Do you know who Spitz is?
I can't remember now, but this was 22 years ago.
He's an author that you thought had something to help with, your opinion?
Yeah, when I did a search and on withdrawal rates, he was the only person I think I found that dealt with withdrawal rates in an endowment fund and for retirees.
This question was examined by Spitz et al., who looked at the common fund in the US. They used very conservative assumptions of 7% real equity and 2% real bond return for a real return with 60-40 equity bond mix of 5%. So 60% equity and a bond mix yielding, I guess, 5%. Is that right?
Yep, approximately 5, I think 5%.
Okay. Then in the next paragraph, you wrote in your report, in terms of investment strategy, Spitz et al. Note, page 32, and now in quotation marks, more importantly, comma, over the long run, this higher return, and then in brackets, from more equities reduces risk. Period. Most people define risk as worst case results, and the graphs show, comma, our example's diversified portfolio with a higher expected return has a worst case result far better than the average college portfolio with fewer equities when examined over 20 years. This is a very important comment. In the risk estimates in table 2, and I'm going to pause because table 2 is found at page 55 of your report. We'll make sure I got that right. Yeah. No, hold on. Table 2 is found at page 31 of Exhibit 45, page 55 of the compendium. We don't need to turn it up just yet. I just wanted to make a reference. We are looking at annual variability in returns, but for endowment funds with very long horizons, this is not the correct perspective. In their case, the higher returns build up a cushion so that even when the stock market crash comes, there is still enough market value to sustain a higher withdrawal rate than for a lower risk portfolio. I'm going to stop there. Now, would you agree with me, sir, that your comments about in the long run equities reduce risk?
They reduce the risk of going bankrupt. They reduce the risk. We're not going bankrupt. They reduce the risk of not earning a target rate of return. So if your target rate of return is, say, the bond rate, then you've got a better ability to beat a pre-specified target by investing in equities. The actual variability around the wealth from your investment doesn't change.
Sir, Professor Stiglitz testified that, and maybe it's counterintuitive to someone like me who needs to plan for retirement, but his opinion was that long-term investors can ride out the storm, and there's actually less risk by buying equities if you're in it for the long term. You agree with that?
I would agree with that. Now, I should mention, I was on the governance committee of the pension and the endowment funds at the University of Toronto in 2000, I think 9 to 12. U of T went to 80% allocation of equities from 60% just before the financial crisis. They lost a huge amount of money. Did they ride out the storm? No, they didn't. They did. And I was on the governance committee complaining about what they were doing because they panicked. So it's okay, Professor Stiglitz and myself saying in the long run, you can ride out the storm. That's absolutely correct. If in these cases, Monte Carlo, which is what Spitz did, you just look at the probability of getting certain rates of return and you say, okay, I'll ride that out. I'll ride that out if I lose 20% or I lose 30%. U of T lost more than that. They didn't ride out the storm. They de-risked the portfolio right when the market went down. So, and I was on the governance committee complaining about this, looking at what U of T did. So you're absolutely correct. I believe, in fact, if you took people out of it, if you didn't let people get involved in managing money and you just put it on autopilot, so you didn't panic, then that is absolutely correct. The problem is people panic. And I can tell them don't panic, but people panic. That's unfortunately the reality of it. So the question is, and I don't know the answer to this, would the RST bands have put it out to private management and put it on autopilot and never ever reacted to a loss of 75% during the Great Depression? My advice to them would be, yes, put it on autopilot, do not panic. But in practice, people unfortunately do panic.
Can we get any guidance from the spending patterns of Red Rock First Nation during the Depression? Maybe that helps us tell them whether they would ride out the storm. I don't see them spending their capital during the Depression. We went through the slide.
Well, that's true, but the capital wasn't in the stock market. The capital was in the band trust accounts, which are set up to be basically risk-free. So
That's
trying
not
to
the
work
point.
out how they would have reacted if they'd lost 75% from looking at how they actually reacted when they didn't lose any money at all. You can't draw those conclusions. You don't see why they would panic or if they would have panicked. I mean, I would like to think U of T, for heaven's sakes, we've got all these brilliant minds at U of T. They're sitting around, professional money management, and they panic.
But all you're saying is that the minds at U of T aren't that brilliant. I
No,
understand that.
I would say they're too brilliant. Perhaps if Your Honor can give us $3 million for a chair, we can.
This is the third ask.
Well, I know. Well, it's obviously, perhaps we can hire some more brilliant faculty. But
Look at
panic has got nothing to do with how clever you are. Panic is a behavioral characteristic. How very clever. I will give you an example. During the South Seas crisis in the UK in around 1750, Sir Isaac Newton, one of the most brilliant minds in history, he basically got out of the stock market, the South Seas Company, after he made money, and then it kept going up, and he got back in. He put all of his money in the South Seas Company, and it went bankrupt. So that was probably the most brilliant man or one of the half a dozen most brilliant people of the last 200 years. And he came out with the famous phrase that we use in finance all the time, because he said, I can understand the motions of the heavenly bodies, but I can't understand the madness of crowds. And that's something that you have to remember, the madness of crowds, panic. And John Maynard Keynes has another famous phrase. He said, the market can remain irrational longer than I can remain solvent. So you can look at this, and if I could put it all on a computer and say, take the human emotion out of it, which we're doing actually in artificial intelligence, then you can see through a crisis. But unfortunately, people panic.
Can we go to page 23 of your report, exhibit 45, please? In the paragraph page, the first incomplete paragraph, so 3 lines from the top, you wrote, in this fundamental sense, Mr. Ambashir's comments, AMBACHTSHEER', that's one of the other experts.
That's right. And I hired a Keith shortly after this.
Okay, about the Crown's policy inducing more stable returns or misleading. Now, he was advocating for the band trust rate, correct?
That's true. That's correct. Super Treasury bill.
For investors with long-term horizon, the immediate volatility can be managed by an appropriate withdrawal policy such that the volatility is of less relevance than it would be for an investor with a short-term horizon. You see that there?
That's correct.
And you agree with that statement?
Yep, I agree. I mean, that's the basic principle of finance. The longer you invest, the more risk you can undertake.
Can you help me again? I'm on page 3.
No,
Of
page
the-
23.
Sorry, thank
My
you.
apologies. Page 23, exhibit 45.
Got it. Thank you.
And so that statement was true when you made this report?
That's correct. And it's true now.
Oh, wow, I didn't even have to ask the question. On page 23 of exhibit 45, compendium page 47, we have in the second last paragraph, the following appears. 100% equity strategy clearly generates more uncertainty in the market value of the fund. However, the higher expected rate of return of equities over bonds makes this a less risky strategy over the long term than the Crown strategy. That was true back when you wrote this?
That was true then and it's true now.
Thank you, sir.
The longer you invest, the more opportunity you've got for the risk premium, the higher rates return on equity to overcome the risk of equities, providing you do not panic.
Yes.
And I'd have to say, I've got 100% equity portfolio. I should be in bonds by now at my age, but
At page 27 of exhibit 45, in the middle of the page, you have an opinion where you say, third, if in 1975, the Crown had solicited professional advice in the management of the band capital account as an endowment fund, it would almost certainly have realized the suggestion of a balanced mix of 60-40 common shares and long-term bonds. As indicated above, many believe that this is unnecessarily conservative and a 75-25 or even 100% equity mix is more appropriate. Was that correct? True in that
that's correct.
at the time?
Yes, at the time that was correct. That was true.
And would it be correct now?
Which part of it?
All of it.
Which paragraph were you on, please?
The paragraph that starts third, if in 1975, the Crown had solicited professional advice.
I'm really having a hard time following this.
Okay,
Because I thought, I'm very sorry if it's my problem. I thought you said page 47.
no,
Exhibit
page
45.
27.
27 on the,
I apologize, I must
Got it.
not be articulating very clearly today. So
Got it.
page 27 of exhibit 45,
I've got it. Thank you.
in the middle of the page says, third, if in 1975, the Crown had solicited professional advice in the management of the band's capital account as an endowment fund, it would almost certainly have received the suggestion of a balanced mix of 60-40 common shares and long-term bonds. Stop there. That was your opinion in
That was my opinion
1975?
Then probably the 75% I would moderate,
Well, how do you mean moderate?
reduce. When I say, and a 75-25 or even 100% equity mix is more appropriate. That's very aggressive. I would have, that's my own portfolio, but I wouldn't recommend that for an endowment fund.
For an endowment fund, you'd stick with the 60-40.
Yeah, it's time true and tested for the last 30-40 years, yes.
As far as you know, but you don't know more than 30 or 40 years.
That's correct. What we have is the information from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, which actually looks at these funds, and they have the median pension fund return and the asset allocation in a pension fund. I don't think, well, they may cover endowment funds as well. But that only goes back a relatively short periods of time because we've only had pension funds and endowment funds for a relatively short period of time.
All right, I thought we talked about the Harvard Endowment Fund being around for quite a while.
Well, I know that the Canada Pension Plan was established in 1961.
I think,
know
believe it was
for a fact that
66.
The old age pension didn't come about until 1927. So you're telling me about Harvard. I don't know about Harvard, but I
Okay.
do know about Canada.
On exhibit 46, I only have
And
one
on that
reference.
issue, I should say, Mr. I forgot to say that I was on an expert panel appointed by the province of Ontario to look at the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. And OTPP used to fund their pension simply by having notional provincial bonds in their portfolio. In 1990, only 32 years ago, did they start actually a managed investment fund and manage underlying assets. And I was asked, along with 4 other experts, to review OTPP's policy. So that's a history of the biggest pension plan well, one of the biggest pension plans in Canada. It's got a history of the last 32 years. And yet we've had school teachers in Ontario for a long period of time. So my knowledge of endowment funds and pension plans, getting back into the 19th century, I have no evidence whatsoever of pension plans and endowment funds in the 19th century. In fact, the first pension was in Germany in 1887, and it was a state pension. It was not a managed portfolio of equities and bonds. That's what I declare to be the fantasy. The fantasy is taking what we know now and projecting it back into the 19th century when the situation was entirely different.
And I'm not sure what question I asked to elicit that, but perhaps we can move on to exhibit 46. At exhibit 46, at page 6 of exhibit 46, this is, yes, it's compendium page 73. So we're looking at exhibit 46, page 6 of exhibit 46.
Thank you.
Compendium page 73 under actual investment strategy. And in your rebuttal report, and again in your, I guess your reply report, you identify the critical thing that needs to be done is you have to have an investment strategy, but you also have to have a withdrawal strategy. Is that correct?
Well, the critical thing in what? I mean,
In knowing how to use money, how to invest money, it's not enough just to have an investment strategy. You need to have a withdrawal strategy.
well, you have to know your client.
Right.
And,
You have to know what they need the money for.
Yeah, and that's why I said on page 28 of your brief and this is totally standard, 4 critical steps in providing investment advice. First, evaluating individual circumstances. Second, establishing the investment objectives. Thirdly, setting the asset mix. And fourthly, constructing the portfolio.
So where are you referring to, sir?
Page 28 of your
Compendium?
compendium. Page 4 of my report on Sampson and Emerson.
Okay.
So that's the standard thing that any financial planner does. Is you have to identify the problem, you have to set the goals of the people that you're managing the money for. You then have to work out what that means in terms of an investment strategy, and then you have to implement the investment strategy.
And anyone coming into money, whether they come into the money in 1850, 1920, 1929, 1985, are gonna have to look at these critical steps to do it right.
Now, this is common sense stuff. It's not, there's no Nobel Prize in this. It's just know your client and understanding what they want out of their investment strategy.
Yes. So just going back to exhibit 46, page 6 of the exhibit, page 73 of the compendium. In the second paragraph, the last sentence reads, however, the critical point is not whether this is a great investment, and by this you were referring to the banned trust rates,
That's right.
but whether 100% of a portfolio should be invested in it. 100% investment, even in a super treasury bill, is inconsistent with appropriate long-term investment strategy. And that was true when you wrote this document,
Absolutely.
and it's
The-
true today.
That's true. If you just give me a fabulous investment opportunity, as a risk-free investment, I do not put 100% of my money in it. You diversify. You buy some equities, you buy some bonds, and you buy some treasury bills. So if it's a great treasury bill, then you put your money in that treasury bill, but you won't put 100% of your money in it.
I want to thank you for your time, Professor Booth, and I don't have any more questions for you. I believe Mr. Gover might have some questions and the judge might have some questions.
None for me at this time, thank you. All right.
I think I understand what the Madam Court Reporter has just raised with you, Your Honor, and I'm aware of the fact that I'm one of the few things standing between people in the room and a long weekend. I'm
I
happy
think
to
it's
take a
just- I
break
think it's
now.
just a break that we.
Should we take, the options include an abbreviated lunch hour or a 15-minute break and coming back and getting through this? I expect to be 30 or 40 minutes. And I don't know if my friend for the Attorney General has redirect or not, but I realize that people will
take
need a
my-
break before continuing.
It's pretty close to 1. I can do it.
Yes.
You're on the witness stand. Professor Booth, can you handle what could possibly be if we take a 15-minute break, so it'll be an hour total before we're done.
Not a problem.
All right,
All right.
let's take a
Thank
15-minute
you.
break. Thank you.
This court will recess for 15 minutes, resuming at 1:10. This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. I've prepared a compendium which I'd ask be marked for identification as Exhibit O. And there ought to be a copy before Your Honor and also before Professor Booth.
Thank you.
And Professor Booth, my name is Brian Gover. I act for 7 First Nations that are added party plaintiffs in this matter. I'll start with this, and it takes us to paragraph 4 of your reply report, which is marked as Exhibit 39 in the proceedings. And what you say there, Professor, is that present value calculations require, and I quote, looking at what the First Nations actually did, not fantasizing about what they might have done, end quote. You say that at page 4 of your reply report?
I'll accept that, yes.
And you built your model based on what you termed actual data and not on, and I quote, creating a fantasy world that never existed. Those are your words.
That's correct.
Now, you've included that language as a criticism of the approach taken by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you claim that their approach is fantasizing about what the bands might have done. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And creating a fantasy world that never existed.
That's correct.
That's a colorful turn of phrase. Isn't that right, Professor?
Absolutely.
But your model assumes that if the bands had received additional funds to which they were entitled, they would have spent it in the exact same way that they spent money that they did receive. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
And that involves assuming what the bands would have done with the money, correct?
That's correct.
It involves assuming what the bands might have done with the money, correct?
That's correct. Based upon the factual record, yes.
And that in itself is inherently speculative. Isn't that right?
It's speculative in the sense that we don't know how they will behave in the future. All we know is how they behaved in the past. That's correct.
With the amounts of money made available to them then, correct?
That's correct.
Now, do you agree with me that in some sense, a world in which the Crown actually paid augmented annuities is itself a fantasy world that never existed?
All right. The world in which they paid augmented annuities is a fantasy world.
Yes.
Well, it's certainly a world that didn't exist. We wouldn't be here if they'd actually paid augmented annuities.
So in your terms, that's a fantasy world, Professor, correct?
No, that's we're actually going to deal with that problem. The fantasy world is assuming that a 60-40 bond portfolio in 1850 was a reasonable proposition, which it wasn't.
No, no, no. It's a fantasy world to assume that the money was paid in 1850 and 1860 and 1870 and 1880 and 1890 and so on.
That's a fantasy. Well, I wouldn't say it's a fantasy world. It's certainly a world that didn't exist. It never happened. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in litigation.
So we'll fall back to those words of your choice. Is that right? Or a world that didn't exist.
It is a world that didn't exist, but those words are specifically referring to the bring forward analysis.
You take the point, though, Professor Booth, that any approach to present value is going to involve some level of assumptions about what the bands would have or could have done with the money, correct?
That's true. You have to make some assumptions because the monies weren't paid.
That's right. The monies weren't paid. Now, Professor, you're not aware of any statutory or regulatory constraints on the uses that the band could have put on the annuity money if they had received it. Is that right?
This is what I talked right at the beginning of the hearing, whether the monies would have gone into the band trust accounts, they're constrained. If the monies had gone into annuities, the individuals could have spent them any way they liked. If the monies had gone into band funds outside of the Indian Act, then they wouldn't have been constrained. But we don't know how those allocations of monies would have occurred.
Exactly. We're back to the level of speculation, aren't we?
Well, we're back to the level of speculation in terms of the fact that we haven't been given direction from the court because the court hasn't decided on the amount of money and how it's going to be allocated.
If treated as an annuity, the money could have been spent as the band saw fit, correct?
If the money had been paid out as annuities, payments directly to the individuals, then the benchmarking exercise would have treated those individuals similar to Canadians at large in terms of their spending patterns.
Are you under,
Some of it being saved and some of it being consumed.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Professor. You understand that the treaty with which we're concerned in this case, the Robinson Superior Treaty, has only one other parallel in all of the treaties, and that's the Robinson-Huron Treaty. You understand that?
I understand that almost every other treaty is a dollar figure and closed deal sort of thing. Whereas this includes the possibility of an augmentation. That's correct.
And a collective amount to the annuity payable to the bands. You understand that?
I understand that's the £500, correct?
The collective amount.
Yes,
Now, you understand that unlike other money for bands under the Indian Act, annuity money is not subject to restrictions or oversight by the government. Fair?
that's correct. That money is paid directly to individuals as annuities.
And in that respect, this is similar to the unpaid annuity money that was at issue in the Beardy's case.
Absolutely.
The recipients were free to use the money as they pleased, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Now, you constructed your model based on the observed spending patterns from the bands that you looked at with respect to trust accounts. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in effect, your model presupposes that the bands received the annuity money that they were entitled to on time and that they would have spent it in the same way as they spent the money that they did have.
Broadly, yes.
You accept that had the bands actually received the annuity money that they were owed in the past, they may have spent it differently than they spent their existing money.
That's correct.
And on a basic level, for example, if a band already had built a school using existing money that they had in their trust account, they wouldn't build a second school just because they had additional funds available, correct?
That's correct. But I mean, the school is just part of social investment. Question is, would they have spent more on social investment or infrastructure or housing? That's a separate issue.
Right, and we simply don't know.
That's correct. All we know is what they did do.
Right, and if they had paved a road once, dealing with another kind of investment, they likely would not need to pave it again in the same year just because they had more money available, correct?
Well, that's true, but they might, instead of having a gravel road, they might have had a concrete road. I don't know. They might have traded up in terms of the quality of the investment.
Now, if the bands had access to significantly more funds, that may have actually changed their spending patterns. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely correct, yes.
You accept the general economic proposition that poorer families tend to spend a larger proportion of their income on consumption items.
That's correct. I went through that yesterday with the survey of British families in Canada in 1938, English Canadians.
And that's because they need a larger proportion of their income to cover the necessities of life, like food.
That's correct.
And as families tend to get wealthier, they tend to spend a lesser percentage of their income on consumption and to save and invest more of their income.
That's correct.
A person who's struggling to get by paycheck to paycheck may not be contributing to their RRSP every year.
That's absolutely correct.
Right. And you don't need to be an economics professor to know that, right?
You need to know how to manage your own personal financial affairs.
Correct. But if they receive a large promotion with a much higher salary, then they might start saving more because they have a spare income to do it with.
That's
Fair.
correct.
Now, in a similar vein, if the Robinson Superior Treaty bands and their members had access to significantly more income every year, they may have spent relatively less on consumption goods, their immediate needs, and saved or invested more or relatively more for the future. Is that fair?
That's correct.
It is not necessarily the case that the spending patterns of the bands would have been identical regardless of their level of revenues. You agree?
That's correct. That's why we used a high rate of savings, 35% in our benchmark analysis.
Let's turn to consumption and its value. You accept that some consumption does have a very significant long-term value to individuals. Is that right?
I'm not sure about that. What sort of consumption are you talking about?
Well, I asked the questions around here, but I'm going to come to the point and you'll help us with it, I hope. To take you back to your testimony from yesterday, you said to be generous, you classified anything that has value after 1 year as investment rather than consumption. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
And your example from yesterday was healthcare spending, correct?
Yep.
And you said, yep, but that's a yes for the record, sir?
Yes,
Thank you. You said going to a doctor would be something you could classify as an investment because if you don't die or you don't get sick, you're better off. Fair?
absolutely. Health, better quality individuals, better quality of life, they're more productive.
Right. And for your honor, that was at page 125 of yesterday's transcript. You did still classify some forms of spending as consumption though, correct?
That's correct.
And those were brought forward at the inflation rate or the consumer price index.
That's correct.
And a major example, and the one you gave yesterday, was the lunch that you were treated to by counsel for the Attorney General, the lunch from Tim Hortons, correct?
I was thinking of the opposing counsel's $1 steak meal versus, but correct.
Correct. And you consumed it, that was it. No
Gone.
lasting value, correct?
Yes,
Now, the example that is used is of a starving person. You're aware of that classic example when we
Yes.
talk about consumption? And I'd like you to consider someone who's scavenging through garbage cans at the side of Highway 17 for food. And without spending some money on food, that person could die. You understand the scenario?
yes,
So the consumption spending, if it was actually spent, would have a huge long-term benefit for him, correct?
yes. And we went through this with Mr. Justice Whalen, where I gave the equivalent example of a person dying of thirst in a desert, where a glass of water is immediately consumed, but the person lives, and as a result, it's got an extremely high rate of return.
I'd like to come back to the example of the person scavenging for food in the garbage can at the side of Highway 17, because that's not a hypothetical, Professor. You
Okay.
understand? So the consumption spending on food does have a long-term benefit for that person, doesn't it?
That's correct. It could have a long-term benefit.
Could enable him to survive.
Well, anything that enables somebody to survive who otherwise would have died has got a very, very high rate of return.
Could enable him to have a healthier life.
That's correct.
And in that case, consumption spending has a massive return for the person, doesn't it?
Yes, I'd admit that.
If he didn't engage in some consumption spending, he wouldn't survive, he wouldn't have a healthier life, and therefore wouldn't earn any return in the future, correct?
Correct.
Can I just ask you to give me a chance here?
Yes, I'll pause for a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Professor, someone who is barely subsisting in that way, spending on consumption of food, I'm going to suggest to you, engages in an expenditure that is similar to an expenditure for healthcare. You agree with me on that?
It could be defined that way. Yes,
And yet, you classified that as consumption rather than investment and brought it forward at the rate of inflation, correct?
that's correct.
Now, you've touched on this already and I'll be brief, but your model assumes an 80% consumption rate for amounts distributed to individuals. Is that correct?
Yes, it's 65 to 80%.
Right.
20% saved versus and up to 35% saved.
That was one of your models. You
That's
have a second model, right?
Correct.
And my point about the model that involves the 80% is that's an 80% number that is constant over time, isn't it?
Yes, we could have done it year by year, but there's not enough data to go back to 1870 or 1850 to do that year by year.
Exactly. So for every year, you assume that 80% of the amount distributed to individuals would have been spent on consumption in that model, correct?
Correct.
And you've touched on this. You also did an alternative model that assumed only 65% consumption, correct?
Correct.
But again, that was a constant 65% over time.
That's
Right.
correct.
Now, you provided an expert report for the specific claims tribunal in the Beardy's and Okamasas case, correct?
Correct.
And your report on that case was on present value calculations.
Correct.
And ultimately, Justice Slade for the tribunal did not adopt your methodology in his final decision, did he?
He adopted essentially, we gave a range. We did a benchmarking analysis where we said this is what happens under certain assumptions. And he adopted the compounding at the long Canada rate. And the difference between what he awarded and what I recommend or what we recommended was trivial. It's almost exactly the same.
Well, Justice Slade did not agree that the award to the First Nations should be adjusted downward on the basis that some portion of the money in the past would have been consumed by the band members.
That's correct. That was one of the figures we gave him in the benchmarking number.
And in this case, you refined your methodology to account for Justice Slade's decision in Beardy's, did you?
We included consumption at the CPI rate, but we didn't. We looked at the Beardy's and Okamasas decision because that was a decision applying to individuals. But also, you have to remember the decision of Justice Slade was also based upon what he regarded as an egregious act by the Crown. The nature of the breach determined in part what the amount of compensation should be.
Moving away from Beardy's though, back to this case, the sum total of your adjustment as a result of the Beardy's case was to treat consumption at the consumer price index or the rate of inflation, correct?
That's correct.
And Justice Beardy, and perhaps I'll take you to the compendium now at tab 1. Pardon me. Oh, thank you.
I got it.
Thank you. It's Justice Slade in the Beardy's case. This will take us to the compendium at tab 1, pages 17 to 18. And I'm going to read to you section 52, which starts at page 17 and carries over to page 18. This is after talking about the scenarios created by the respondents experts, Professors Booth and Kersner. Now I pick up at paragraph 52. The model appears to be internally inconsistent. Professors Booth and Kersner say that the percentage of income used for consumables decreases as family income increases. Hence, a larger percentage of capital would annually be available for investment. But this is not reflected in the formula applied to derive the annual amount of unpaid annuity plus accumulated interest. The percentage of capital available for investment remains constant in their mathematical formula. Of course, a fixed percentage of capital yields a higher amount each year, but the benefit of a higher percentage is not in their calculation. Have I read that correctly, Professor?
That was his decision. I wouldn't think that that is actually correct, but it's in the decision, yes.
So what, now I'll get the judge's name right myself this time. What Justice Slade said was that your model was internally inconsistent. Is that correct?
He did say that, yes.
The criticism was that you did not decrease the percentage spent on consumption over time as family income would increase from the receipt of the funds. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
A larger percentage of capital should be available for investment rather than consumption each year, correct?
That's correct.
But your model in this case continues to apply a fixed percentage for consumption over time, as we've established. Isn't that right, Professor?
That's correct. But there's no data to do anything else.
Right. So for you, it was always 80% or it was always 65%, right?
That's correct.
So you didn't refine your model based on those comments from the specific claims tribunal, did you?
That's correct. In the benchmarking episode with the 2080 and the 6535, you're absolutely correct. In the amount that comes out of trust accounts, it's implicit in the amount that was saved within the trust accounts, the actual decisions of the band.
Now, Professor, your instructions in preparing your report for this case directed you to the Supreme Court of Canada's recent decision in the Southwind case. You
That's
understand that?
Yes,
And in this respect, Your Honor, I'll take the court to Exhibit 38, the primary report prepared by Professors Booth and Kersner, and page 50. I'll give you a moment to turn that up. So it's Exhibit 38, page 50. And the portion that I'll take the witness and the court to can be found toward the bottom of the page. And I'm going to pick up with the words "for the purpose," and I'm going to take the witness to what is itemized as number 2. And what is reflected there, and this is Ms. Evans' instruction letter to you, Professor Booth, you understand that?
yes,
For the purpose of preparing your opinion and calculations, please consider the following facts and make the following assumptions. Number 2, courts in Canada have provided guidance on the factors to be considered when determining compensation owed to First Nations plaintiffs for historic losses caused by breaches by the Crown, and have examined methods for estimating the present-day value of historic losses in such circumstances. 2 relevant cases from appellate courts are Whitefish Lake First Nation in Canada and Southwind in Canada, and I've omitted the citations. So you had that guidance from counsel for the Attorney General,
that's
correct?
correct.
And your instructions continued on the next page, page 51, and you were specifically asked in point 4 to take into account this guidance. You were instructed to take into account this guidance. Point 4, the Supreme Court in Southwind provided the following guidance. First bullet point is the one I'll take you to now. Compensation seeks to restore the opportunity that the plaintiff lost as a result of the breach. The plaintiff's lost opportunity should be assessed under the presumption that the plaintiff would have put the asset to its most favorable use. The most favorable use must be realistic. Have I read that correctly, sir?
That's correct.
And you knew that that was your instruction from counsel for the Attorney General, correct?
Correct.
And also, at point 4, toward the bottom of the second point, Ms. Evans has pointed out the Supreme Court took no issue with the manner in which the trial judge brought forward historic losses to present value in that case, citing the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Southwind at paragraph 145, and that's the decision Justice Karakatsanis, you may not have known the last part of what I just said, but you understood that to be in your instruction letter as well, correct?
Well, we're aware that in Southwind, they took no issue, but it wasn't a detailed analysis of what rate to use. The Supreme Court simply said, we take no issue with it.
So to come back to my question, you understood that part of your instructions were to take into account that the Supreme Court of Canada took no issue with the manner in which present value had been calculated in the trial judge's decision, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you agree with me that the Southwind case is only referred to in 2 places in your entire report.
That's probably true. If that, I would take that as correct.
All right, and first in paragraph 22, and I'll take you to that. Paragraph 22 is on page 7 of your report, and this essentially refers to the fact, and this is in about the 6th line in paragraph 22, refers to the fact that you were an expert witness in the Lax-Hooler Southwind case, correct?
That's correct.
And then again, in paragraph 81, you cite the Southwind case in footnote 42. We'll go there and refresh your memory. And the exact passage in paragraph 42.
Paragraph 42 or footnote 42.
Pardon me, paragraph 81.
Got it.
Sorry. Long week. Paragraph 81 at page 30. What you say there is, we were advised that courts in Canada have provided guidance on the factors to be considered when determining compensation owed to First Nation plaintiffs for historic causes caused by breaches by the Crown, and have examined methods for estimating the present day value for historic losses in such circumstances. Paragraph 42 then reads, the 2 most relevant cases from appellate courts are Whitefish Lake, Supernote 4, and Southwind in Canada. And I'm omitting these citations. I've read that correctly, sir?
That's correct.
And you've accepted that those are the only 2 references to Southwind in your entire report.
I would accept that, yes.
Yeah. You don't cite Southwind for the most favorable use principle, do you?
That I think is part of equity. So
Most
I think it's cited also in Whitefish.
It's part of your instructions.
Yeah, okay.
Part of
No,
your
I-
instructions in this case, Professor. You don't cite it anywhere, do you?
We don't cite it, but it's not specific to Southwind. It's also in, as I said, in Whitefish.
You don't cite that principle anywhere in your report. You can't point to a single place, can you?
Probably you're correct. I don't ever remember writing that down.
And that is so despite being specifically instructed to consider that principle, a principle discussed by the Supreme Court of Canada in the context of calculating compensation for historic breaches of the Crown's duty to First Nations, you chose to ignore it, correct?
No,
Well, you just can't point to it though, can you, sir?
no, I can't point to the fact that we didn't reference it, but I can point to the fact throughout our testimony, wherever possible, we counted things as investment. And we took the most favorable view we could possibly do throughout our report.
Well, that will be for Her Honor to decide. You appreciate, Professor. You understand that?
Well, your honor can decide that, but it is a fact That
All
when
right.
we asked Ernst and Young to look at the accounts, we asked them to classify as many things as possible as investment. And that's throughout our report, everything that we did.
The facts will be determined by the court. You must accept that.
Well, I know for a fact what we did.
All right.
And I know for a fact what we told Ernst
And-
and Young to do. And I know for a fact what's in our report.
Let's
So
end
the
it with
court
this.
can decide that it doesn't meet the criteria laid down in Whitefish and in Southwind. That's absolutely correct. That's the court's prerogative.
All right. Thank you for that, Professor. And let's end it with this. Professor Booth, you provided expert opinion evidence on how to calculate present values of First Nations losses in the Southwind case, correct?
Correct?
In the Beardy's case, correct?
Correct?
And in the QA-OT case, correct?
Correct?
And in each of those decisions, the court or tribunal rejected your approach that amounts that would have been spent on consumption should be brought forward at a lower rate of return, correct?
No, I'd say they rejected our approach until this case, we didn't bring it forward at any rate of return. Consumption by definition is consumed. That's what we mean by consumption. And we didn't give any rate of return for consumption.
The courts didn't accept your approach where you didn't give any rate of return for
I would
consumption.
accept that, yes.
That
And
was
we
my
don't-
question.
And we don't do that in this case.
And nevertheless, despite your approach having been rejected by multiple courts and tribunals over the last 7 years, the approach you're advocating for in this case is merely to reflect it at the consumer price index or the rate of inflation, correct?
Well, that's not merely, I mean, there's a big difference between compounding at 0% and 3.5%, as I show in the report. It's not a merely, it's a very significant change.
Well, from the position you'd taken previously that had been rejected, fair?
That's correct. And that makes a substantial difference to our estimates. Even though, as I say, in economic terms, consumption is gone and generally is not regarded as giving a rate of return because there is no rate of return on it. So that makes a substantial difference in our report.
And you've agreed with me, though, that for someone living at a subsistence level, consumption has a very different significance than it does for somebody who can afford 100% equity portfolio or someone who practices law, perhaps.
Well, certainly, I think even some of my students have 100% equity portfolios and we talk about it and they're not particularly wealthy either. That's
No, but to
that's a
answer my
person-
question, let's talk about the subsistence person, not students in your MBA course at the Rotman School. Someone at a subsistence level, and I've given you the example and we've had testimony about it, sir. Someone scavenging in a garbage can for food. Subsistence to them means consumption, means that it has greater significance to spend for the necessities of life than it would for you or for me. Fair?
That's a fair comment. And in fact, it's the same comment that the Justice Slade made in Beardy's and Okamassis when I think he said in the decision, of course they would have spent the money on consumption. They were desperately poor. They were subsistence people. And it's also consistent with the guidance we've repeatedly given in courts that, and particularly in the Alderville case, that when you start thinking about a rate of return on consumption versus savings, it does mean to say that for the same breach of the Crown, if you follow Justice Laskin's decision to the letter, our interpretation, you end up giving different compensation for exactly the same breach, which I have moral problems with. So if you're telling me that there's some problems in the approach, I 100% agree with you.
All right, thank you. And you've taken ownership of the words fantasy world, and words that have just come out of your mouth now are desperately poor subsistence people. Thank you for those, sir. Those are my questions.
Just let me catch up with things for a moment. Thank you, sir.
Professor Booth, we're not going to get into anything new. I'm just going to ask you some questions to help explain or clarify issues that arose from your cross-examination. And in particular, there were two questions that were asked by the court that I want to go back to. And they both had to do with the hypothetical we discussed at the end of yesterday. This is the hypothetical where we were talking about an immortal person who didn't get a meal or a basket of food in 1876. But then in 2020 got $34 to buy whatever he could have bought, a comparable basket of food. Whatever he could have, a basket of food he could have bought for $1 in 1876. Do you remember that hypothetical?
Very well. I was
Okay.
thinking all night about somebody that lives forever
Okay.
and whether that's a realistic contingency.
So this individual, although this individual gets paid the present value of the money he was denied in 1876, the court raised the question, he hasn't been compensated for having to wait all that time. So he's been compensated the $34, but he hasn't been compensated for all that period of time that he's been waiting. Do you remember that question?
I do.
And so really, he hasn't been compensated for the inconvenience or annoyance of having to wait that long. So why does your model address the monetary value, but not the non-pecuniary value of this in this scenario?
When we're dealing with non-pecuniary issues, and in particular, the nature of the breach and whether it was an egregious breach or whether it was a minor oversight, as it were, then we have no special skills in looking at the nature of the breach, which is why we try to retreat from offering an opinion, which is the job of the court.
So then
And we have been in cases where opposing counsel, sorry, not opposing counsel, opposing witnesses have made statements that we would regard as being the reserve of the court. And
So-
we're not willing to do that.
that takes me then to page 30 of your report. Can you bring up page 30 of your report? This is exhibit 38.
If it can be brought up on the screen, I was told not to bring my report into the
Oh,
hearing room.
I'm sorry, you should have a copy of your report. Do you mind then if I approach the witness to give the
Please
witness
go-
a
please go
copy of
ahead.
this report? This may explain why you're a little bit. Where's your report?
Page 30.
Page 30.
Thank you.
So my friend, Mr. Schachter, took you to a phrase from footnote 41 of this report. And footnote 41, the sentence that Mr. Schachter took you to was, our estimate of compensation is purely an economic one. Can you please read for us the rest of that footnote?
The possibility of assessing punitive damages for compensation estimates is not, in our opinion, for the experts. It is the prerogative of the court.
Right, thank you. So going back to this hypothetical, when we were talking about it, this is getting back to the question that the court had asked, that the individual here has waited 145 years and then finally receives $34 for the meal that was missed in 1877. Do you remember that
I
scenario?
do.
And it is the case that for every year that the dollar has not been paid, that individual will receive, let's say, $34 or something similar.
That's correct.
So for all of those years that the individual couldn't buy a basket of food, they're not just receiving $34, they're receiving 145 years times $34 or something similar.
That's right. If they're denied a meal every single year, then what we would award is the cumulative value of all of the meals that have not been given.
Okay.
So in a generational situation, we're giving the current members of the band the value of all of the meals the previous members of the band never ever consumed.
So that brings me to a question that the court asked about, there was a bit of confusion when we discussed the hypothetical about what the individual we were talking about, whether that individual ever got a meal at all. There was the scenario, did the individual get a meal in 1876 or did they not get a meal at all? And your answer to, when we were talking about this hypothetical was, and here I think I'll pull it up. It was at page 187, which I think my friend can pull up. And I can't go quickly. Sorry about that. Have we got it on the screen then? Page 187 is where I wanted it. Because I'm going to quote from what you said and ask you to explain it. Apologize for the delay. Have we got 187? Okay, so you say here, and you'll see in the middle of the page, the court says, perhaps there's a misconnection here. I think the hypothetical was he never gets his meal, right? So this is what we're talking about. The quote above that, you said, and up until recently, we didn't apply rate of return to consumption. The reaction to the court decisions would now be given CPI. And we've basically given the meal back to this person. What do you mean by we've basically given the meal back to this person?
Well, with CPI, you're basically taking into account the loss in purchasing power of a dollar. So if in fact, in 1870, they weren't given a dollar, so they couldn't buy a steak meal, we would now give them $34 to take into account the purchasing power over time. So in that sense, there is a rate of return applied to consumption.
Now, the last question I want to get to is a math one. And it comes up at your testimony earlier today. And I think I'll ask my friend, my colleague to bring up on the screen the rough version of the transcript from 11:03 this morning when we were talking about an equation. So when I want to also take a look at your expert report at paragraph 95. Oh, sorry, 98 it is. It's on page 36. So we've heard this a number of times. Professor Booth gave the same evidence about how you calculated the nominal annual rates of return. And I'm looking at page 36, paragraph 98 of your report. It's also in your slide deck. I think it's at page 45. It's reproduced in your slide deck at page 45.
Yeah.
Follow along. I'm just indicating that this is something that you talked about in your evidence. So the equation you have here is the real rate. Let's use the business one because that's the example you used earlier this morning. So I'm looking at 98 sub B.
I'm just getting to the slide deck, please.
Yeah, the slide deck was page slide 45, Justice Hennessy. And this is just we've simply reproduced, Professor Booth has simply reproduced what he has at paragraph 98 of his report.
Thank you.
Right. So the equation you describe here is calculating the nominal annual rate of return. And as I said, I'm going to pick the business one because that's the example you spoke about. So we're looking at 98 sub B. The annual rate of return for business spending was calculated as the real rate of 1.082. That represents an 8.2% real rate, correct?
Correct.
And then you multiply that by 1 plus inflation for the year,
That's
correct? So that's going to gross up the number. It's going to make the number bigger than 8.2%.
In every year, we don't allow negative inflation. Which
Right.
is what happened during the 1930s.
And then you multiply that by your depreciation factor, which because it's a fraction, it actually is going to reduce
That's exactly right.
the rate. Okay. So the equation here that you set out at paragraph 98 is real rate times inflation rate times depreciation. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So to be more specific, then it's real rate expressed as 1.082 times 1 plus the inflation rate.
Which gives 1 plus the nominal rate.
That's right. So, and how we express the inflation rate, I know Professor Kirchner took us through that. How would you express the inflation rate if the inflation rate was, say, 3.5%?
1.035.
Thank you, 1.035. And then you multiply that by, in the case of business, 0.95.
That's correct.
Okay, so I want to take a look at what you said earlier this morning at 11:03. First of all, you explain that here in what's on the screen now is from 11:01. You say you were trying to correct Mr. Schachter's equation. You said there are a couple problems with this equation. So the first fundamental mistake is one that I'm not going to deal with. The second is that's a real rate, and we took 1.82, for example, for business, and multiplied it by 1 plus the rate of inflation, right? So, so last year that would have been multiplied by 1.64. I take it that means there was a 6.4% inflation rate.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, so that would have meant about 15% for the year. Amount potentially it's accrued, included in the business account. And then we took depreciation on that amount. So this, what you're saying here is consistent with your equation in your report, right?
That's correct.
Okay, later down the page at 103, when you were asked, Mr. Schachter asks, can you tell me what your formula is? I'd like to write down the formula. And here the formula looks a little bit different. So I'd like you.
Are you making reference to 1103?
Yeah, and just give me a minute. My colleague will get it up on the screen. It was there a minute ago. Just to keep going down a little bit further.
All right.
Here we go. Stop. Thank you. Excellent. So Mr. Schachter asks at 11:03:40. Well, actually 11:03:38, Mr. Schachter, or no, the court asks, do you have a formula that you recommend? And your answer there is, it will be 1 plus D times, and then you go through the equation we've already talked about, 1.82 times 1 plus the inflation rate times 1 minus D. What is the point of adding in the 1 plus D in that equation?
It's because when we look at the trust accounts, we do not have enough data to distinguish between a new asset, which is the one, and the reinvested depreciation or maintenance on that asset to preserve the asset. So, as I said in my direct, Dr. Stiglitz would have been perfectly correct if we could just identify the actual new asset, and then we totally ignore all maintenance, because the maintenance is only there to maintain the asset.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. So this equation that you've given us at 11:03 is something different than what you've done at paragraph 98.
No, it's the equation that we've got in the book is applied to dollar figures. The difference between us and Dr. Stiglitz is when we look at the dollar figures, we include everything that was spent on business, not just a new asset like a new car. We include retuning the brakes and putting a new engine oil and all of the things you have to put into a car
Right.
to
And-
preserve its value.
And so are you telling me that's represented by the 1+D?
That's D, concept, I mean, it's, look, when you have your car, you don't get a new engine every year. You do some spending, you do some maintenance, and then after 3 years, you need a new brake job, and after 4 years, you need some other things done. So you have to maintain the car and spend money on the car. When we look at the records in the trust accounts, we cannot distinguish between buying a new car and having a brake job on that car. If we could, we would just put the car in and then we wouldn't take depreciation, because all of that brake job, the new engine, the new oil, all of that maintenance is worthless, because all it does is maintain the value of the asset. We can't do that because the quality of the data in the trust accounts isn't good enough to do that. So we've taken the second step, which is to throw everything into the trust accounts. Maintenance, new brakes, new wheels, new tires, and the car itself. And then we apply a rate of return, and then we subtract the depreciation. So if you look at the formula, 1+D times 1 plus the rate of return plus 1 plus inflation times 1 minus D. If D is 5%, we multiply by 1.5, and then because that includes all this maintenance, all of the new brakes, all of these other things going on. And then we multiply by 0.95. And the effect of that, 1.05 times 0.95, basically removes the depreciation. So you get to what Dr. Stiglitz would want, which is ignore depreciation. We do it by including all of the spending that's going on. And we do that solely because of the quality of the data in the trust accounts.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Booth. Those are all of my questions in redirect.
Thank you.
It's all done. All right. Thank you very much.
No
Professor Booth?
questions?
I have no questions.
Of all the questions you asked, I was expecting some questions. Okay.
I like to ask them as they come up. So it's my time and my opportunity to thank you, sir, for your contribution to this case. We know we all know it's been a long-standing project for many of us, including for you and for your colleague. We appreciate your contribution to this case and your whatever inconvenience or joy there is in traveling to Sudbury. And we thank you for the respect you have shown this process. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here, and I apologize to Mr. Schachter if I jumped on some of his questions a little bit too early. I'm afraid that's just who I am.
I'm sure it's all forgiven. Thank you. May I wish you all safe traveling. May I wish you all good health, very good health. And I believe you have been told, or we're finished for the day, so we can go off the record. I believe you have been